In telling horror stories about shadows on the wall, we must ask where they came from. We must ask why our house smells of smoke. Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice8Rack here, aka Don't Call Me Your Prodigal Son, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're doing it. We are finally doing it. A video that my audience has been asking for since before I started making YouTube videos as my full-time job. Today, we are finally going to delve into the differences between mill and discard, two game mechanics within Magic the Gathering, and asking what the aesthetic, ludonarrative, philosophical, and gameplay differences of the two are. And we're going to do that in a very detailed but concise way. I've always been fascinated with alternative ways to engage with games media. Very rarely will I ever start a new game and not choose a fiddly archetype or suboptimal playstyle over a standard or strong route to overcoming a game's obstacles. So when I got into playing Magic the Gathering, and in amongst the somewhat standard dragons and zombies and wizards and warriors all trying to win through massive damage or huge board states, and discovered both mill and discard, I was immediately hooked. Not only do these two mechanics represent fundamentally different ways of playing a game of Magic, but their aesthetics as well stood apart. Both abstract and gory, cryptic and foul, gothic and Lovecraftian, but thankfully without the racism. My first standard deck ran playsets of Pilfered Plans, Consuming Aberration, and Nightveil Spectre. The first card that I ever traded for was Lazav Demir Mastermind. My name is Spice8Rack, named after my fascination with 8-Rack, Modern's discard deck, and my logo is one of the gargoyles from Shrieking Affliction, but instead of shrieking, it's giving you a nice pie, cause I'm a little softy and a cutie. But in amongst my love for mill and discard, it's long been a fascination of mine as to what exactly sets these two mechanics apart from each other in terms of their narrative. Yes, we know what cards mill decks, but what does it mean to be milled? What does it mean to be discarded? What makes one form of magic one and not the other? What is the actual difference between them beyond their gameplay functions? Well, that's what this video seeks to answer. So, come with me now on a detailed yet ultimately concise journey as we explore the gameplay, aesthetic, ludonarrative, and philosophical differences between mill and discard. Have they been that way the whole time? Oh, for fuck's sake, it's mill and discard. Oh, I'm gonna have to do the whole thing all over again.
Get the tour then.
I beg your pardon? Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice8Rack here, aka a strictly worse in every way Jacob Geller, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're doing it. We are finally covering mill versus discard, the topic that I have been teasing for the past 4 odd years, and we're going to do it in a very detailed, but ultimately very concise capacity. But before we get into analysing the differences between mill and discard and what those differences even represent, I think it's very important that we ground our understanding in what mill and discard are fundamentally as game mechanics within Magic the Gathering. Partially because I think it's good that both you and I are going into this analysis with the same fundamental understanding, but also because I know that there are some people who choose to watch my videos who have no frame of reference for what Magic the Gathering even is. These people confuse me, but I do cater to them, so big up if that's you, I guess. In a game of Magic the Gathering, you have a hand of cards, a deck of cards, called your library, and a discard pile, where all the cards that have been destroyed or cast end up. All the cards in your hand are cards that you're able to play and cast, whereas all the cards in your library you are unable to play or cast until they go into your hand. Except for like some cards in Magic the Gathering do break that rule, but like let's just pretend that those cards don't exist for the sake of argument. Discard effects cause you to take cards directly from your hand and put them into your discard pile. As you're discarding a card, it doesn't come into play unless it has a rule that says otherwise, and you don't get an opportunity to cast that card unless it has a rule that says, look, Magic the Gathering is a complicated game. Mill, similarly to discard, takes a card from your deck and puts it into your graveyard. It doesn't enter your hand, and it certainly doesn't enter the battlefield Narcomedes, where I swear to fucking God you better get out of this shot right now. So, fundamentally, both mill and discard do the same thing in that they take one card from one zone and put it into another. However, the zone that they take that card from is different. For discard, it's the hand, and for mill, it's the library. As a result, the best place from my perspective to begin analysing what mill and discard represent and mean would be to look at the zones that they are taking those cards from and ask what those mean for the game. And luckily, I don't have to speculate about that because there's a phenomenal flavourful source that comes directly from Wizards of the Coast. In this 2008 article by Doug Bayer that for some reason I've screenshotted through the Wayback Machine. What? The then advanced creative designer, now creative director for Wizards of the Coast, lays out what the library represents in a game of Magic.
A subset of the spells you've learned and of the lands you've come in contact with during your career as a mage. The arsenal of magic and mana bonds that is stored in your long-term memory.
Whereas he says that the hand represents
your short-term memory. Those spells and mana bonds that you have present right in your conscious mind.
So there we have it, spelled out in black and white for us. Your hand represents your conscious mind, your deck represents your long-term memory. As a result, we can now view mill and discard effects through that specific lens in how they interact with those two narrative ideas. And this reading of mill as a more fundamental undermining of one's psyche directly feeds into its major gameplay distinction between it and discard, that being that mill can actually win or lose you a game on its own. I don't know why, but I've kind of gone very Welsh just then. Not sure why that happened. I have been filming for fuck me 3 hours. I'm on page 1! You heard Welshie right. Whilst losing cards to mill or discard can frustrate your ability to win or even play a game of Magic, only mill can end a game on its own. If your entire library is empty, milled out to use Magic parlance, and you go to draw a card from it, you lose the game on the spot. Unless a card effect says other— God damn it! Magic the Gathering is a viper's nest of contradictions! It should actually be said that if you're playing a game like Commander, for example, you can lose through another means. If you get dealt, for example, 21 points of damage by one player's commander, you can also lose the game like that. But I didn't really feel the need to make that distinction apparent within this video if I wasn't absolutely certain that my comment section would have been lousy with pedants if I hadn't have announced that caveat. And if there's one thing I don't like pedants being, it's lousy and in my comments. I can't believe I have to become the very pedant I just derided, but I fucked up. At no point throughout the entire production of this video did I remember that poison indeed is a built-in way to lose a game of Magic. I think seeing Slowbad turned into an agent of phyrexia made me purge all memory of that fact from my head. It is true that in all games of Magic it is possible to lose via poison, regardless of if infect, toxic or poisonous cards are even played. It may not be relevant for the vast majority of games in Magic in comparison to Life Loss and Mill, certainly before Scars of Mirrodin came out, but it is still an inbuilt lose condition. Thankfully, whilst this is a massive mistake on my part, the existence of poison doesn't, at least from my perspective, nullify any of the conclusions I come to about mill magic in regards to its lose condition. I'm sure that an analysis of what it means to lose to poison versus losing to normal damage would be interesting, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Anyway, this is all just to say that any time I say something like, there are only 2 intrinsic ways to lose a game of Magic, just imagine that I then followed it up with all of this spiel. Okay? Look, it's either that or I spend 2 weeks reshooting every single time I put my foot in my mouth, and frankly, I was already taking the piss a little bit with how long I spent making this video. Okay, back to it. As a result of Mill being Magic's only intrinsic alternative win condition, it has always been steeped in a cult fascination, both from Magic players and indeed Magic the Gathering designers like Mark Rosewater himself.
Where does my love for milling come from? Without a doubt, it stems from my love for alternative win conditions. There's just something about winning in a different way than normal that just revs my Johnny sensibilities.
Thanks for providing some voiceover for the line there, James, and also thanks for putting an inexplicably sexual spin on the read for revs my Johnny sensibilities. You've done well on this one. Now, whilst games of Magic have always been able to end as a result of a player trying to draw a card from an empty library, the actual prospect of milling your opponents out not only wasn't really possible in Magic's inception, but also certainly wouldn't have been called that. Like, I am sure that somebody has cast an Ancestral Recall in order to force their opponent to draw from an empty library at some point in Magic's early history, but it was only in 1994 that mill as a term was coined in Millstone, the first card printed which put cards from your opponent's library directly into their graveyard. This began the fascination with mill as an alternative win condition, legitimizing it and also naming it. However, actually winning with mill would be a pipe dream for Magic players, both casual and professional, for years. Michael Loconto represents the first player to actually win a Pro Tour with a mill deck back in 1996, with a blue and white control shell, the main win condition of which were 3 copies of Millstone. It was just 3 copies of Millstone, that was it? Oh, sorry, and a backup win condition of beating down with 2 copies of Blinking Spirit. Blue-white control players on Arena have no idea how good they have things today. But the actual effectiveness of mill as a strategy early in Magic's history is kind of unimportant. Millstone laid an aesthetic foundation that future mill cards, and by extension the magic that mill cards represented, would adhere to, and we can see the kernel of one specific icon and image in Millstone's flavor text.
More than one mage was driven insane by the sound of the millstone relentlessly grinding away.
Insanity is such a core component of modern mill Magic that the word sanity appears on a whole host of cards specifically designed to mill your opponents out. Additionally, the overwhelming sound of the millstone feeds into another repeated trope of mill cards. Grind Clock, Screeching Scab, and the droning bureaucracy of persistent petitioners all confound your ears, whereas Glimpse the Unthinkable, Nemesis of Reason, and Grisly Spectacle overwhelm your eyes. These cards represent a mixture of the kind of distractions that would frustrate a mage's ability to recall complex spells, but also represent magic which rips at the very mind of the mage themselves. There are other ways that mill Magic attempts to undermine this idea of long-term memory, and one of these ways is through the literal destruction of knowledge. Things like books, cultural artifacts, or indeed entire libraries, taking your deck, your library, to its logical conclusion. However, as Magic developed and evolved, and indeed as mill became more and more a widespread ability and eventually keyworded as being mill took on far less of an exclusively literal outlook, as the flavor text of M14's version of Millstone reads.
Minds, like mountains, are never so grand and mighty that they can't be reduced to dust.
Here, the millstone is a symbol for the passage of time and the weathering of one's mind, rather than the literal sanity-churning noise of its original incarnation. Also, yes, I am aware this is the M19 version of Millstone and not the M14 version, like I said I'd put on screen in the footage. They have the same flavor text, it doesn't matter, but for some reason, whenever I tried to import the M14 PNG into my Premiere Pro, the whole program just crashed. I don't know why, but we're rolling with it, okay? Abstraction has become modern mill magic's bread and butter. Thassa's Bounty, Ambassador Loquatus, and Drowned Secrets don't explicitly show what or how the mill effect is being achieved, but rather leave that up to implication. All three of these cards are, of course, associated with the aquatic, as are a bunch of other mill cards. The ocean-dwelling cephalids, the Nephalia Drownyard, the liquefying magic of mystic redaction. Many mill cards represent their effects in a way associated with water. Even the colour, which mill is most associated with, uses a water droplet as its symbol. As Michael Foucault puts it, water and madness have long been linked in the dreams of European man, from fictional characters like Ophelia in Hamlet to the maddening sirens that dash ships against the rocks. Even the chaos of madness has seemingly inescapable tropes. On that topic, dreams are absolutely another repeated motif in mill. Dream twist, drown in dream, and startled awake all associate the realm of disturbed sleep with that of madness. Now, I think it's important that we pause for a second and take note of a couple of things. First and foremost, that whilst we have been told that mill magic seeks to undermine our fundamental long-term memory, and that is indeed what our deck represents, a very significant number of mill cards that we've covered and that we even haven't seem to focus more on madness, either as a means of undermining that long-term memory or as the goal of mill magic in of itself, suggesting that our deck does not actually necessarily fully represent our long-term memory, but is akin more to a sanity meter as such. This will also give me the opportunity to put madness on my conspiracy vision board, but spelled correctly. The second thing is that, as we alluded to right at the start of the video, there's a lot of shared space aesthetically between mill and discard as gameplay mechanics. All of these themes and tropes at the moment that we have covered are mostly unique to mill, but as we get into now discussing discard effects, we're going to notice a lot of shared space between the two, which makes working out the actual differences between both forms of magic quite tricky. Fear as a motif is a great example of this. The chill of foreboding is the kind of fear that removes cards from your library, but a frightful delusion is the kind of fear which takes cards from your hand, whereas horrifying revelation and Demogorgon's clutches are the kinds of terror that do both. Indeed, there are a number of cards with both mill and discard effects simultaneously attached to them that imply a definite overlap of the, quote, mental areas that these effects target. Siren of the Silent Song, Mind Drain, and Vicious Rumours all seemingly target both your long-term memory and your conscious mind. Altogether, this leads to the conclusion that whilst the library and the hand do represent different zones of the brain, as it were, they are still one and the same entity, and where an effect can frustrate one side of that entity, it may also more or less directly affect the other. Vicious rumours, for example, when taken literally, can cause both a temporary loss of information or literal knowledge as hearsay contradicts facts previously taken as true, but can also have a detrimental effect on a person's more fundamental mental fortitude, decaying trust and certainty if this is a rumour about someone you know, or causing anxiety, confusion, and a decline in self-image if this rumour is about yourself. Whilst there is undoubtedly a crossover between mill and discard's interest in literal knowledge, the ways in which both of these magics go around approaching that subject are wildly different. Mill seeks to erode and destroy knowledge, whereas discard, more often than not, seeks to steal it. Many dozens of cards with discard effects contain the theme of thievery. Pilfer, Dream Stealer, Kite Sail Freebooter, all of these and more take cards out of your opponent's hands as semi-literal objects, sometimes to be returned if the thief itself is eliminated. Whilst mill magic tends to focus on memory as a totality, discard magic seems far more concerned with specific ideas. Inquisition of Kozilek, Phyrexian Espionage, and Elspeth's Nightmare seem to seek specific targets within the minds of their victim rather than desiring to wipe them clean. Additionally, discard magic is, on the whole, represented as having far more visceral material impacts on its victim than mill magic. We've talked about Mill's abstractions and Discard's literal thievery imagery, but Discard spells like Noggin Whack show its effects being enacted via a literal lobbed brick. Bad Deal shows a handshake oozing blood, and I highly doubt that whatever's about to happen immediately after this scene on Brain Pry is going to be even slightly metaphorical. And, in my opinion, this viscerality ties back into the core difference gameplay-wise between Mill and Discard, in that only one can actually win you the game on its own. Don't get me wrong, it's famously quite difficult to win a game of Magic the Gathering if you don't have any cards in your hand. However, there's no intrinsic way that causes you to lose the game in of itself. As a result, cards like the Rack, Liliana's Caress, and Tiny Bones need to exist in order to synergize with the effects or results of causing your opponents to discard cards in order to make them lose life or deal them direct damage. And their nature as cards which directly deal damage to your opponent informs the literal violence seen in the narrative of other discard effects. At least in my opinion, I could be reading too much into that. Continuing on with our distinctions here, it's important to note that there are significant differences in the creature types within Magic that tend to embody one or the other of these mechanics. We've mentioned before that water dwellers often find themselves tied to milling cards, be them great leviathans or lowly crabs, but far more often, utterly different creatures embody the idea of discard magic. Spectres, for one, are the discard creature, with 21 of Magic's 25 spectres producing or directly benefiting from discard style effects. Rats as well, a popular symbol for pestilence and insanity, despite, just being the most perfect, clean and well-behaved babies a goblin could ask for, are also tied to discard and hand-sized reduction mechanics. Even the ways that creatures can cause mill and discard effects respectively tend to differ. Whilst both often occur through enter the battlefield effects, mill creatures tend to do their milling through triggered or activated abilities, whereas discard is tied to creature cards far more often through their ability to deal direct damage to your opponent or upon their death or sacrifice. Once again, differentiating mill as a far more immaterial or learned form of magic, with discard being produced through visceral and material means. Literal disease and parasites are another way that this viscerality is embodied in cards like Smallpox, Brainweaver, and Christ on a fucking bike, whatever the shit this thing is. Additionally, ideas that are far more understandable to reality, such as grief, bereavement, and the toll of war, cause discard, whereas truly unknowable horrors beyond our reality cause mill. A suggestion that discard magic is somehow a more vulgar, opportunistic, and maybe even less skillful or honourable form of mental magic. A perfect theme when considering discard's root colour is black mana. There's also a distinction that can be drawn between mill and discard-oriented planeswalkers. Liliana, Davriel, Kaya, Obnixilis, and Angrath all use discard magic on one or more of their iterations. Kaya and Angrath's characters were, when these cards were printed, an assassin for hire and a plundering pirate respectively, embodying the underhanded thievery and espionage we discussed as one of discard's key aesthetics. Obnixilis, in this iteration, is a crime boss, and his discard ability is also representative of the kind of back-alley browbeating seen previously on cards like Brain Pry. Liliana too is famous for her double and triple crosses, stealing information and artifacts for her own ends, but also for her erstwhile master, Nicol Bolas. Indeed, a whole host of Nicol Bolas's cards also force discard to happen, which in his case is indicative of both his master manipulator persona, but also his ability to snap minds in half and command the drone that remains. And finally, in the lore, Davriel's unique power is spell stealing, able to take his opponent's magic and use it against them. In one way or another, all of Magic's discard-themed planeswalkers are thieves of magic, artifacts, information, trust, or minds themselves. There are fewer mill-oriented planeswalkers. Indeed, there are realistically only two in Magic's whole pantheon. Jace, an illusionist who I think is contractually obligated to get amnesia once per story arc. Does getting completed count as amnesia? I'm going to say getting completed counts as amnesia. And Ashiok, a weaver of nightmares, sculptor of fear, dream renderer, and smoky bitch. Though Jace is technically an illusionist mage, he also quite famously utilizes memory altering and wiping magic on his foes and himself, so milling fits perfectly here. Ashiok's mastery of the realm of dreams, as we've discussed before, is a frequent narrative location for Mill to be found. Ashiok also dabbles in a little bit of discard magic being the cause of Elspeth's nightmare, which makes absolute sense, seeing as in that case Ashiok was specifically searching for evidence of phyrexia. I presume the story arc still hasn't come out about that. That was a few years ago now. I don't think we're ever going to find out what happened on Theros, are we? Absolute narrative incompetence aside, however, I think it's pretty clear that all of Magic's Planeswalker characters that in some way embody either mill or discard effects in gameplay also embody one or more of these aesthetics within their actual character. So, there we have it. I think we have gone through the differences between mill and discard narratively as they appear in Magic the Gathering. One is rooted in blue and employs both distracting magic as a means to frustrate your opponent's ability to recall spells in the moment, but also uses more metaphorical, abstract, and fundamental experiences, monsters, and rituals as a means of undermining your opponent's long-term memory and sanity, eventually concluding at a point where they are unable to function as a mage at all. The other, rooted more in black, is far more underhanded. You sneak into your opponent's either metaphorical or literal stronghold to steal away their best spells, allies, or treasures, frustrating their sanity and memory, but only up until a certain point, and only through far more vulgar means, such as blunt force trauma, and then either using that as a tactic to eke out an advantage during a traditional duel, or by then subjecting your opponent to extended torture, ripping out far more precious memories from them when eventually they expire as a result. That's it. That was Mill versus Discard. That did not need to take the better part of 3 years to come up with. I'll tell you that for nothing. But yeah, thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a lovely day. And as always, stay...
I don't think you're done.
What? I explained the narrative differences between mill and discard.
Not adequately, though.
What would you have me do?
I have some notes.
No, I'm okay, thanks. I don't actually need your notes. Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice 8-Rack here, aka the word on the street if that word was gay, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're doing it. We are finally doing it. We are looking at mill versus discard. This is a video topic that my audience has been asking for since before I started making YouTube videos as my full-time job, and we're going to delve into these two game mechanics within Magic the Gathering and ask what the aesthetic, gameplay, ludonarrative, and even philosophical differences between these two mechanics are. And we're going to do it in a very detailed, but ultimately very concise way. Now, on first blush, the answer may be pretty obvious. You know, mill focuses a lot on imagery associated with water. It looks into the themes of madness, memory, entropy, and dreams, whereas discard tends to be focused more along the lines of literal thievery, stealing information or treasures, or with horrible vermin causing distress, or diseases addling your mind, or torture extracting information out of you. There's some crossover between these two aesthetics, but broadly speaking, we all kind of already know the difference between mill and discard. That's why I put these up before I started filming this video, because these are baby distinctions that babies know, and I didn't need to make a video explaining the baby distinctions, because you are not a baby. I hope. Don't watch this if you're a baby. Don't watch this if you're a baby. We're going to talk about heavy non-baby subject matter. Now, mill and discard effects that target your opponent, it is true, more often than not fall into one or more of these aesthetics. But it gets a little bit more confusing when those same mill and discard effects are targeted back onto their caster. Iconic cards like Merfolk Looter, for example, and indeed Rummaging Goblin, along with Millstone itself, are the material foundations for common magic parlance. To loot is to draw a card, then discard a card. To rummage is to discard a card and draw a card. Now, raiding a stash of magical artifacts is very much in keeping with Discard's theme of thievery, but the real question is, who is the looter looting from in this scenario? Like, with Kaya Ghost Assassin's final ability, where your opponent discards a card and you gain a card, the ludonarrative is very clear. You are gaining information by taking it away from your opponent. However, in this scenario, you are losing information when you receive it, and vice versa. Similarly, self-mill effects often fall outside of the pre-established aesthetics of aggressive mill strategies. Covetous Castaway, Mulch, and Stitcher's Supplier all look incredibly different to cards like Traumatize, Fractured Sanity, or Fraying Sanity. Now, these two contrasts don't necessarily present a massive issue when it comes to our understanding of mill and discard magic. Like, we could very easily say, for example, that, well, when mill effects target yourself, they mean something different than when they target your opponent. However, that doesn't account for the fact that there are a whole host of mill and discard effects which utilize these aesthetics whilst they are targeting yourself and not your opponent. And like, what's the deal with that? What's up with that? Also, it's really difficult to pin a conspiracy board when you're trying to crouch in shot and you have a microphone in your hand. I do this all for you, babies. Oh, thread the needle, hang on, thread the needle. Thread the needle, 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 thread the needle. But seriously, this does present a difficulty when it comes to our understanding of what mill and discard represent, indeed what the hand and library represent in Magic. If there was a clear distinction between self-discard and aggressive discard, for example, then we could just knock this whole argument on the head. But the fact that there are both unique, different aesthetics to self-discard and aggressive discard, as well as shared aesthetics between self-discard and aggressive discard, it's really quite difficult to just ignore that discrepancy. Is this a fundamental flaw in the aesthetic design of Magic the Gathering? Well, yes, but I don't think necessarily the way that you might think it is. It's not lazy designers, it's more like foundational philosophy. When Doug Bayer wrote that your library represents
a subset of the spells you've learned and of the lands you've come in contact with during your career as a mage, the arsenal of magic and mana bonds that is stored in your long-term memory.
He certainly wasn't... Wait, hang on, why am I looking at this on the way back machine? He wasn't lying, and he certainly didn't forget about a bunch of cards which contradict this definition. It's that this might be true in a default game of Magic, but as with all things, it can be redefined by things acting upon it and how we view it. If you were to take a low-hanging tree branch in the forest, for example, and view it in a vacuum, you can describe it and guess that it's made of wood or has leaves, etc., but you would just view it as a tree branch. However, if you were to come across this branch after a 2-hour walk through the forest, it quite readily becomes a resting place. If you are fixing to set up a camp nearby, it also becomes potential firewood, and if you fall asleep that night without ensuring that you've sufficiently doused your campfire, it will become the foundation of a criminal negligence lawsuit. Similarly, your library is, at default, a collection of cards which all individually represent spells and locations to fuel a wizard's duel. It's called the library after all, not your memory. It only becomes a representation of your memory when cards that define it as your memory act upon it. Curse of the Bloody Tome interpreting your opponent's library literally is not contradicted by Drown in Filth interpreting your library like a clogged up sewer drain that needs flushing out. This is true for every kind of spell in Magic. For example, some draw card effects interpret the act as the literal delving of material magical resources, like careful consideration, whereas the card draw on Agent of Treachery interprets it more like a bounty for a successful 3-part heist. When you mill out in a limited game after the board hits a stalemate and you end up slowly drawing your entire library, that lose condition feels very different to when you are purposefully milled out via cards that attack your mind, for example. The former is just an inbuilt failsafe to ensure that games of Magic can indeed end if no one can deal direct damage to anybody. Narratively, you run out of steam. When you're being milled, however, you running out of cards becomes you falling into insanity, or losing your memory entirely and being unable to compete in the duel any longer. Neither of these nor anything else is the correct way of understanding the narrative of losing a game because you draw from an empty library. The reality of things is always constructed and defined by how we view them, by how societally we are encouraged to view them, and only ever in regards to how those things relate and act upon the world around them, and vice versa. Nor does any one thing exist objectively and in any one fixed state. And if you find yourself kind of nodding along to that at home, then congratulations, you have just been indoctrinated into agreeing with a basic understanding of Judith Butler's refutation of the internal truth of sex and gender, as well as the Marxist material dialectic. You really thought the Spice 8 Rack video wasn't going to go down this fucking road? That's a you problem at this point, buddy. This understanding does reveal kind of an unfortunate flaw when it comes to our analysis of mill and discard. We have the normal aesthetics for mill and discard, and then we have cards that exist outside of that norm, such as how spell shapers interpret your hand as being a literal cachet of magical potential that they can turn into different effects. And there are other cards which don't interpret your hand as anything more than a cold game piece, such as how Stern Constable uses discarding cards to fuel its mechanic for no perceivable reason. Talking about Innistrad, aka the world that is to Shadowmoor what the MCU is to cinema, Laboratory Maniac is a great example of this redefinition. Firstly, it redefines the lose condition of milling out into a win, implying a fundamental inversion of the conclusion of being milled, memory loss and madness as a good thing. But upon closer inspection, Labman is less asking you to give into madness, but more so represents the kind of ultimate sin, the Promethean crime of Victor Frankenstein. Here, the empty library becomes a metaphor for a line that ought not to be crossed, much as Frankenstein crossed the line between life and death. What happens when this aptly named maniac succeeds in his personal great inversion? What even is this great inversion? It's very much left up to interpretation. And in interpreting the library exclusively as a symbol for intellect, memory, or sanity, the narratives of cards like Laboratory Maniac kind of get lost, or at least watered down to a simplified preset conclusion. I love to compare effects like this together. Thassa's Oracle wins the game in a very similar way to Laboratory Maniac, where if you have anything less than 3 cards in your library when you cast it, you win the game on the spot. Of course, however, what these respective cards are saying actually happens as a result of their effects. What their effects even mean, what it means to win the game as a result, are completely different, despite being blue cards with deeply similar gameplay implications. And that's ludonarrative, baby! I think. Honestly, the word has been so misappropriated lately, it's sometimes impossible to understand if I've been using it correctly over the past few years. In attempting to define what mill and discard magic are supposed to represent, we necessarily have to construct an in-group and an out-group. Mill and discard cards that we believe ought to count when it comes to constructing our definition, and those which we believe should be considered as aesthetic or narrative outliers, to be disregarded. But where I or you or a games designer draws the line is largely an arbitrary one. Like, discard magic seemingly has a monopoly on thievery aesthetics, which is one of the more clear narrative distinctions between it and mill. But since M21, blue and black rogues had various roguish behaviours attached to the mill mechanic rather than discard. Now, since then, only 8 rogues have been printed on paper with mill effects, the majority of them in Zendikar Rising. So do we discount this interpretation of Mill as being a minor outlier that existed solely for the benefit of Standard and Limited at that time 2 years ago? Well, 3 years ago, at the time that I'm actually sitting down to record this. Jesus, the script took a long time to come together, didn't it? Or do we also now include theft and thievery as something that does indeed embody an aspect of Mill magic? If so, what does it mean to steal from a library as opposed to steal from a hand? So here we come to a fork in the road. We can either say that there exist some cards which count as mill cards and discard cards, and others which don't really, which use the mechanic but don't embody those effects. But in doing so, we are setting ourselves arbitrary lines. God, that was not as smooth as I thought it was going to be. But in doing so, we work backwards from a pre-decided definition. So we're not really analysing anything at all. We're just cherry-picking examples. We have said, for example, that rats embody discard magic. Therefore, we have to discount any rat that uses the mill keyword. We will find ourselves in metaphysical, inconsolable contradiction. However, the alternative is admitting that this is folly. Okay, this is going to be better. Ow! Oh, it hit me in the eye! Oh, fuck! There will always be some contradiction to whatever definition we try and settle on. What are the philosophies of mill and discard magic? Or what magic indeed is even being embodied in these two mechanics? The fundamental answer is, whatever it is that the game's designers choose to make those mechanics embody at the time. There are certainly norms to both of these mechanics as we've previously established, but fundamentally these norms are incredibly fluid. There is no fixed state to what mill and discard are. Is that it? Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's mill and discard. It's fundamentally pointless to try and come to a coherent understanding of the two. Wow, that's a massive letdown, isn't it? I can see why it took me so long to make this video. I was postponing the inevitable disappointment. Okay, well, I'm sorry for wasting your time, but I hope that you got something out of it, I guess. And we'll do credits now, and as always, please do stay...
I don't think you're done.
What?
It wasn't satisfactory.
What do you mean it wasn't satisfactory? I explained the philosophy behind the folly of the philosophy of mill versus discard. What couldn't be satisfactory about that?
Well, I have some more notes for you.
What do you mean, notes? Wait, sorry, what do you mean by more notes? No, you get out of my house! Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice 8rack here, aka Vampire Bank Holiday Weekend, and welcome back to the channel. It's time. Today's the day. I'm gonna give it to you. After years of teasing this project, I think it's finally time for me to talk about the differences between mill and discard. But what's this? That doesn't say mill. And that doesn't say discard. I'll tell you that for nothing. I've got 2 degrees in creative writing. I know words when I see them. I must admit I've done something a little bit cheeky because I don't want to kick this video off by just talking about mill and discard as mechanics. We all know what they do. Instead, what I'd like to talk about is the philosophy that underpins both of them. But in order to talk about that philosophy, first off, we need to talk about how mill and discard talk about their 2 chief aesthetics, namely being madness and memory. But in order to even do that, we first need to have a conversation about how we talk about these 2 ideas and why we talk about memory and madness in the way that we talk about it. That is so long-winded. I absolutely need to do a rewrite of that introduction.
I don't think it was that bad.
Thank you. You know what? I really appreciate that. That's very lovely of you to say.
The set, however, needs work.
What's wrong with the set?
The conspiracy board aesthetic doesn't work for this kind of discussion.
I don't know that I fully agree with you on that, but regardless, I did pay real human money to buy this, so I'm not just gonna not use it because you told me to. If that's all right. I do appreciate the feedback, though.
I'll just make you do it then.
Sorry, one more time. What did you just say? Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice 8-Rack here, aka a union man in the least gendered way possible, and welcome back to the channel. Now, I know that all of you have been waiting many years to hear me talk about mill and discard magic as they appear in Magic the Gathering, but frankly, it would be impossible for me to talk about how mill and discard represent madness within Magic the Gathering and how madness is represented generally within pop media without first talking about the reality of madness. As fantastical as fantasy madness tends to be, as cartoonish as many people recognise it as, all cultural replication exists as either the refutation, confirmation, or exaggeration of a commonly held perspective of the thing being replicated. Take, for example, the werewolves of Innistrad, or indeed werewolves in general. Arguably, the most iconic aspect of the narrative of the modern werewolf is the transformation from human to feral beast under the light of the full moon. This is a cultural exaggeration of the old superstition that the full moon exists as a herald of insanity. A superstition that Richard Bentall, the author of the book Madness Explained, theorizes has a material explanation.
Before the development of modern lighting, the moon was the main source of nocturnal illumination. People living before the development of electricity would therefore have been especially likely to experience sleep difficulties when the moon was full. It is commonly observed that a period of sleep loss precedes an episode of mania.
In this icon, and indeed in many other images commonly associated with madness, we can see not only the exaggeration of madness, but also how madness is genuinely perceived. The werewolf is an animal that disrupts calm and order, the drownyard erodes structure and subsumes it into chaos, the unknowable monster corrupts and destroys with neither explanation as to why or even how. Most of such similar cultural superstitions have some kind of scientific or material explanation. Troubled dreams as an indicator for madness, or indeed as a cause for madness as embodied in horrifying cultural icons such as the Fae, Freddy Krueger, and Ashiok the Nightmare Weaver, is itself rooted in reality. Neuroimaging studies have shown a striking similarity between how the brain operates during REM sleep and during episodes of psychosis. In both states, specific areas of the brain are activated, like the subcortical structures involved in emotion, and deactivated, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, suppressing important functions such as planning, inhibition, and voluntary control of motor actions. This combination can potentially explain the appearance of thoughts and hallucinations that characterize both psychosis and dreaming. And as far as our brains are concerned, what we dream really does, in a way, happen to us. Even if the logical part of your brain later knows that the dream or hallucination you experienced isn't real, the emotional part cannot set what happened aside and manifests it in some way in our body's response to immaterial trauma. Now, really quickly, I do want to address something that I think a number of people have probably clocked with this video thus far, and that's with the language that I've been using. I've been saying madness or the mad as opposed to mental health or people with mental illnesses, and that's not because I'm attempting to be purposefully edgy. Like, I play Necrons in 40k, more specifically the Annihilation Legion Army of Renown. If I was any edgier than I am already, I would just be a triangle. However, in media like Magic, madness is as much a cultural replication of the stereotypes and symptoms of mental health disorders as is the icon of the werewolf. It would be pointless and even wrong-headed for me to say that the Mad Prophet is a harmful depiction of X mental health disorder, because it's fundamentally not. The Mad Prophet, itself a ubiquitous icon within Western literature, is a totality of madness, an umbrella for insanity, a grab bag of symptoms, a piñata of stereotypes. When I talk about how madness is represented, how the mad are depicted, or what happens when a spell drives you insane, I am naturally and necessarily operating within the linguistic arena of the media that I'm currently analysing. However, this doesn't stop the perceived danger that fictional madness and mad people embody from bleeding into our reality. When madness is on our screens, it usually comes in the form of a violent killer or a dangerously deluded maniac, and a 24-hour news cycle maintained through constant engagement loves to over-amplify stories of crimes committed by people with mental illnesses. Or, when the mental health of a criminal is unknown, parading out speculative diagnoses to fill out the airtime. This, amongst a variety of other harmful practices perpetuated by mass media, leads to people with mental illnesses, disorders or complaints being seen as one and the same with the most extreme real or fictional examples of madness, as being more likely, for example, to be the perpetrator of violence rather than the victim. In reality, of course, it's very much the other way around. This, in turn, leads to both the social exclusion and self-stigma of people perceived as falling into this outgroup, which can have a massively detrimental effect on that person's commitment to a course of treatment for their complaints, as well as their likelihood to seek both social and medical support for their complaints in the future. But still, madness as it exists in fantasy media has always struck a strange note for me. Imagery such as a person chained up in an asylum being tormented by voices and images of devils is about as blunt of an image of madness as you can get. If someone were to describe such an occurrence in our world, any number of people would describe that as more or less fitting in with their idea of madness. But in a game world like Magic the Gathering's Innistrad, where devils exist and mind magic is commonplace, it would be bizarre to call a person who sees such visions as mad. Either they're having a traumatic flashback to an event that could well have happened to them, or they're just looking out of their fucking window. This replication of imagery from our world, which becomes shorthand for insanity in a fantasy setting, is forever bizarre to me when said settings also reproduce the quote delusional visions from the asylum as literal. Oh, sorry, somebody's fucking doing woodwork outside apparently. What time is it? It's fucking 8 AM! Who are you? You fucking bastard! And what's really important to remember for all of this is that our cultural shorthands for insanity and madness, even the idea of insanity and madness as an actually existing thing within our real world from which all of these cultural replications have been drawn, have not existed in perpetuity. In terms of the broad scope of human existence, our modern understanding of the madman is incredibly, incredibly recent. And it certainly didn't come from nowhere. The asylum as an icon that exists today is the culmination of centuries of repression against both the mad and the sane alike. In the 17th century, whilst the class contradictions within feudal society were growing and sharpening, there came a movement that Michael Foucault calls the Great Confinement, where both beggars and idlers were rounded up and placed in large newly built prisons and repurposed lazar houses, where people who used to suffer from Hansen's disease, aka leprosy, had previously been interred. As Foucault writes,
"Throughout Europe, confinement had the same meaning, at least if we consider its origin. It constituted one of the answers the 17th century gave to an economic crisis that affected the entire Western world. Reduction of wages, unemployment, scarcity of coin. The coincidence of these phenomena probably being due to a crisis in the Spanish economy."
Rather than excluding the, quote, idle of society, they were instead taken in by their respective states at the cost of their individual liberty. They were fed, but forced to accept the physical and moral constraints of confinement. However, as crises waned, these places of confinement acquired new meaning and uses.
It was no longer merely a question of confining those out of work, but of giving work to those who had been confined and thus making them contribute to the prosperity of all. The alteration was clear: cheap manpower in the periods of full employment and high salaries, and in the periods of unemployment, reabsorption of the idle and social protection against agitation and uprising.
And if that description sounds creepy but also weirdly familiar to you, then congratulations, you have correctly identified the economic root of what would become the modern prison industrial complex. During this period, madness and indeed the mad were seen as one and the same with beggars and idlers, just more people who wouldn't work within the system. The cultural superstructure of the time then reinforced the economic necessity of the houses of confinement, and so, for the first time ever, madness was perceived through the lens of a condemnation of idle productivity. As a result of this, the poor laws that existed at the time that discriminated against the most needful of society were in turn turned upon the mad, and madness became a newly criminalised boogeyman, and those who were pathologised with being mad were forced to endure incredibly inhumane punishments and treatments, the line between those two often blurring into non-existence. Madness also became used as a convenient social and later scientific way of oppressors to pathologise resistance against their oppression. Drapetomania, for example, was a mental condition invented by Samuel Cartwright in 1850s Louisiana as a means of explaining the abnormal behaviour of enslaved people escaping captivity and fleeing the plantation. And politically and socially inconvenient women throughout loads of European and American societies were conveniently diagnosed with any number of mental illnesses when it was that their families or communities wanted to be rid of them. Kind of like a medicalised witch hunt, but instead of being burnt at the stake, you were locked in a metal or stone box for the rest of your life and medically experimented on. Anglo-Saxon values. The reasons why such inhumane confinements, punishments and spectacles are made of the mad range from the progressive, it's for their own good, to the conservative, they are a threat to everybody else, to the outright fascist, they are subhuman. But all of them find their root in what Foucault suggests is the lens through which we view madness, as a fundamental challenge to bourgeois order and how the mad alienate themselves from it. Essentially, madness represents a threat both to the economic and social structures of society and to the ruling class that seek to maintain and enshrine those structures. This order needs to answer the question as to what is to be done about madness and the mad, but also needs to explain where madness and the mad come from, why it even exists at all. During the period of the Great Confinement, madness, and indeed poverty as well, was explained as resulting from the weakening of discipline and the relaxation of morals, which sounds like a direct quote from today's Republican Party, now that I'm reading it out loud. In the early 20th century, however, modern medicine had developed to the point where madness was perceived less through the lens of personal failure or spiritual unreason, and far more often through the cause and effect of brain chemistry, injury, or disease. And it's at this point in the far from complete history of madness that fantasy tends to draw its inspiration. Just enough explanation as to why madness exists so that readers don't roll their eyes at the inexplicable nature of it, but not so explained and understood that fantastical things can't still happen during a scene or discussion of madness. Magic the Gathering and other works of fiction rely on the unexplainable to fundamentally function. Magic systems are actually a really good example of this. Because magic isn't real, at some point in the explanation for how magic does exist in this world, you will hit a dead end where the answer to the question, but why does that happen, is because it does. Why can people planeswalk in Magic? Because they have a spark. What is a spark? It's a special thing inside 1 in a million people that, when that person undergoes significant enough stress or trauma, ignites within them, giving them the ability to traverse worlds and also have enhanced magical powers. Yes, but what is a spark? A spark is a spark! Who are you? Comrade question? Leave me alone. The same is very much true for fantasy madness, especially in Magic. Oh, all of the angels on Innistrad have gone mad! Well, why is that? Well, it's because 3 of the main angels have been turned mad by Emrakul, and all of their flights have been infected with that madness as a result. Okay, but why is that happening? Well, it's because Emrakul has this aura of madness. Okay, but how does that work? Listen, Jimmy, I'm trying to explain things to you, and I'm trying to do it in a very polite capacity, but if you keep asking me questions and you keep derailing this video, I'm going to show you what the S in Spice 8 Rack stands for. Stands for slap! Oh, how did it take me years to realise I was gay? Now, it's by no means a bad thing to have the weight of some of your fantasy writing borne on that Atlas-like back of because magic fuck you, but madness as a weapon or a fate in fantasy narratives is almost always built on this foundation, and more often than not, as a result, conjures up a lot of the archaic icons and narratives that surround madness that have been dredged up from a pre-Crapellian age. The mad, criminal, and dangerous are more often than not presented as one in the same in these narratives. Madness, when embodied, does not simply become alienated from the order in which it exists in, but it is indeed an existential threat to that order that must be either slain or contained to prevent apocalypse. In containment, madness never finds salvation, but that containment is necessary because without it, the mad will enact harm upon others, either through physical violence or by corrupting others' minds so that they join the ranks of the mad. Fascinatingly enough, in the conclusion of Eldritch Moon, the narrative in which Emrakul has turned the angels and the denizens of Innistrad mad and against each other, Liliana raises an army of the damned, a legion of undead, an icon so intertwined with the biblical apocalypse that it is impossible to separate the two. And yet in that narrative, such a corruption of body and soul, such an affront to God, was presented as a necessary lesser of two evils in comparison to the idea of madness. Isn't that fascinating? Now, you can swap the mad for Marxists or anarchists or trans and queer people or civil rights activists or feminists, what have you, and you have conservative ideology there in a neat little bow. The order exists, the order is good, these people wish to disrupt this order, we need to stop them at any cost. And it's through this lens that Magic the Gathering and lots of fantasy media pretty much exclusively explore the idea of madness. Madness is a bad thing, not to be explored, understood, or liberated, but to be contained, and a very easy way to mass produce cheap fodder for our heroes to slice and burn their way through without too much in the way of a moral quandary. You know, the Gatewatch need to kill a bunch of insane people to stop the big insane thing from making everyone insane. Batman needs to concuss an entire asylum city prison of insane people to stop the big insane person from turning everyone insane. Rose Cotter fails to stop the scary insanity trauma monster from turning her insane, and now that monster's free to turn the rest of the world insane. Spoilers for Smile, by the way. A shit movie. Although the guy from Harold and Kumar rips his own face off using practical effects in a dream sequence. That was really quite dope to see, not gonna lie to you there. That was a completely unnecessary thing to say in this video. I don't know why I did. So, Magic is no stranger to presenting mass unreason or insanity as a self-evident threat for its heroes to fight against. But it's also a threat the game makes towards you, the player. Remember, there are only two ways to lose a game of Magic. Unless you're playing Commander, in which case Commander damage is a thing. A caveat that I did not feel the need to mention if I wasn't absolutely certain that a bunch of pedants would have gone into my comment section to tell me that I'd forgot. Did I say that before? Anyway, the only inbuilt ways for someone to lose a game of Magic is either by having their life total reach 0, very much embodied in cards which depict physical or magical violence, the death of the body, or by having your library emptied and then you go to draw a card from it and fail to do so, usually embodied in cards which depict, amongst other things, the erosion of sanity, the death of the mind. The positioning of madness as equitable with death is hardly a novel notion. It is easy to look at Hieronymus Bosch's The Ship of Fools, a rendition of the then contemporary 15th century practice of towns expelling mad residents onto boats, and see many similarities with how both Charon, the ferryman of the damned, and the damned themselves were depicted. The themes of madness and death are twisted in the same anxiety. Magic positioning madness and death as both equally ultimate ends isn't new, and neither is how both realms are separated from one another in the game. Unless a card specifies otherwise, your life total bears no relevance on the number of cards left in your library, and vice versa. This is true for lots of games media which employ insanity as a trackable statistic. You can be perfectly sound of body in Amnesia: The Dark Descent, for example, whilst your brain liquefies itself at the prolonged sight of the monster. In that same regard, only one of these two lose conditions needs to be met for you to lose the game. And I kind of take this as a vulgar representation of the philosophical theory of dualism. René Descartes, your least liked coursemate's most favourite philosopher, postulated that the conscious mind was quite distinct and separate from the corporeal body, where knowledge and truth, for example, exist in the remit of the mind alone, not the mind and the body, that if you cut off someone's foot, nothing is taken from the mind. A lot of understanding of how the body, brain and mind interact has developed since Mr. I Think Therefore I Am. As Veronica O'Keeffe puts it in an incredibly badass capacity in The Rag and Bone Shop, the brain-body divide tends to dissolve and the soul disappears when the brain causes of mental experiences are discovered. But in order to kind of explain this further, I am briefly going to have to talk about child abuse. So if you don't want to see that, skip to this timecode and you'll zoom on by. For one thing, physical trauma has a demonstrable impact on a victim's mind, which in turn can also cause internal physical issues. Studies have shown clear links between trauma and the body's response. For example, a study began in response to a pattern of incest survivors being diagnosed with autoimmune diseases showed increased abnormalities in the memory cells of the immune system of survivors as compared with non-traumatized peers.
Our study showed that, on a deep level, the bodies of survivors have trouble distinguishing between danger and safety. This means that the imprint of past trauma does not consist only of distorted perception of information coming from the outside. The organism itself also has a problem knowing how to feel safe. The past is impressed not only on their minds, but also on the very core of their beings.
As with how fantasy tends to cement madness in pre- and early Enlightenment notions and images, so too does it with the connection, or lack thereof, between the body and the mind. A magical spell can pass imperceptibly into the brain of a victim and turn them insane in an instant. How the process of phyrexian completion can totally reform the body, but enshrine the mind of the host until the moment is right for the truth to be revealed. Obviously, this isn't universally the case. A poison or pox can addle both the body and mind in magic, but the two are certainly viewed as far from entangled entities. However, in reality, even as the understanding of how the body and mind relate to each other has developed, and for all of the reforms made to the systemic treatment of people with mental illnesses, very little has actually changed at the core of how madness is understood, perceived, and treated. The supposed progressive move of medicalizing madness has done little to abate the way madness is viewed and discussed, as you may have been able to tell from the fact that most modern fantasy media which uses madness as a narrative point does so in deeply antiquated ways. I mentioned Kraepelin a minute ago, a psychiatrist from the beginning of the 20th century who laid the foundations for how mental illnesses were viewed for much of the following 100 years. Kraepelin's big idea, as Richard Bentall describes it, was that
Kraepelin assumed that there was a discrete and discoverable number of psychiatric disorders. Although he recognized that some symptoms could occur in more than one disorder, he argued that each disorder had a typical symptom picture. He also believed that different disorders were associated with different types of brain pathology. On this view, the first step to discovering the causes of mental illness was to identify different disorders on the basis of their symptoms.
Now, on first blush, it could be thought that such a step would be positive to those who society treated as mad. The understanding that madness was not caused by God or a lack of discipline or the corruption of moral fibre, but rather due to biochemical abnormalities in the brain. In reality, however, the treatment of the mad remained the same. The only difference was that the mad were confined because they had a medically wrong brain rather than a morally wrong mind. It maintained the us and them, normal and abnormal, mad and sane lens, only changing the how of why there existed an us and them. Indeed, this fresh understanding of the cause of madness, along with the, even to this day, massively overstated influence that genetics has on the likelihood of madness developing in people, acted as the scientific backbone to the practice of eugenics as it pertained to people with mental disabilities. Indeed, queer and trans folk today are often on the receiving end of a concoction of the worst aspects of both the pre- and neo-Kreplin understandings of mental illnesses. First, that their entire existence is predicated on something being wrong in their head, and secondly, that this abnormality can somehow be transmitted by prolonged exposure to them, similarly to how proximity to the houses of confinement when they existed in Europe was feared to lead to a contagion of the kind of unreason experienced by those contained within. However, as you might expect from the fact that this video is still agonizingly within the second third of its runtime, this biomechanical and indeed metaphysical understanding of madness is both the common sense of the day, but also just incorrect. As Bentall takes us through the history of the development of psychiatry and psychotherapy from the early 20th century to the 21st century, two clear and linked patterns emerge from each account and study. The first is that the Kreplin notion that madness can be both quantified into discrete categories and also its cause can be located in brain imbalances runs into a number of major issues. Studies run to test the accuracy of strict psychiatric categorization would often find that people exhibiting or complaining about symptoms of one illness could just as easily be diagnosed with two or more of these supposedly discrete issues. Additionally, the effectiveness of treatments aimed at resolving the brain pathologies and etiologies that Kreplin assumed were the root of mental disorder and ill health varies wildly. In some cases, the right medication can massively improve somebody's quality of life. In other cases, it's no better than placebo, but with multiple side effects attached. A 2008 meta-analysis on both published and unpublished drug trials for antidepressants, for example, showed that drug-only treatments for depression-related complaints fared only slightly better in treating those respective complaints than placebo. The efficacy of these tests is rated on something called the Hamilton scale, a widely used clinical scale for measuring depressive symptoms and complaints. In this meta-analysis, it was found that groups given drugs performed 1.8 points better on the scale in comparison to placebo groups. However, your score on this scale can range from 0 to 56, with a healthy amount of sleep alone improving your score by 6 points. Indeed, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK requires a minimum of a 3-point change on this scale for the difference to qualify as clinically significant. Obviously, 1.8 is far less than that. If the Kreplin model was correct, then these results would make no sense whatsoever, as it would be possible to cure a discrete form of madness by simply addressing these chemical imbalances. As it stands, long-term studies suggest that today's psychiatric patients do not fare much better in terms of being cured of their ailments than they did when Kreplin was alive. The second issue with the Kreplin model is that a greater mass of evidence is gathering which shows that madness is as much a problem within the brain as it is without, both in the sense that environmental factors can play a larger role in determining whether or not someone suffers from a mental disorder or the symptoms of that disorder than any kind of inherent issue with the brain, but also that madness itself is a very culturally defined and certainly not fixed thing. Most folks understand that medical definitions, like all definitions, change over time, that homosexuality and being trans are no longer considered to be mental disorders, and that drapetomania was just something that a racist made up to appeal to other racists. But what we do kind of take for granted is that the mental health... Oh, did I not have this on for the whole time? However, one thing that we do kind of take for granted is the idea that there are certain symptoms which are just inherently mental health and medical issues, which is not a helpful way of viewing the world. It's not always bad, mind you. The medicalization of epilepsy and the recognition of the symptoms of epilepsy, that's a good thing. Stops people from having epileptic fits. I'm a fan of that. That gets the Spice 8 rack seal of approval. There it is. I forgot to do it, didn't I? Oh! However, there exists a plethora of nationally, culturally, and epoch-specific mental complaints and lack thereof, which I don't believe needs to be explained utilizing our modern understanding of mental health. One proposal from American psychologist Julian Jayne, for example, suggests that the idea of experiencing auditory hallucinations, aka hearing voices, was not a source of concern for a culture like ancient Greece because of a difference between their understanding of the self in comparison to ours today. Essentially, that no cultural structure existed to suggest that there was a difference between hearing a voice from an unseen source and hearing one's own internal monologue.
The things they said to themselves when engaged in verbal thought were experienced as being said by the gods, which is why they had so many gods. Jaynes noted the similarity between the ancient Greeks' experiences and the experiences of modern-day schizophrenia patients, embracing the view that hearing voices was an entirely normal experience for ancient Greeks.
Interestingly, the icon of the Mad Prophet itself represents a cultural linkage between how such a person would have been perceived in the pre-classical age and how they are perceived in modernity. Conceptions of madness as pathological disconnections from the external world is a very recent development. As Siddhartha Ribeiro writes in The Oracle of Night, it was only with the development of Christian civilization that the divinatory powers of the madman were divested from him to the exclusive privilege of the sanctified and beautified church. The madman himself progressively became more segregated, first as pagan, then as sinner, then as unwell. More often than not in media, however, the Mad Prophet is proved correct, or at least their quote-unquote delusions are given new, accurate readings, retrospectively, of a story's ultimate conclusion. In original Innistrad, the five-legged shrew that lives in the moon with a voice like whispering thunder on the flavor text of Mad Prophet was meaningless babble, up until Shadows over Innistrad, where Emrakul arrived on the plane, turned everybody mad via the voices in their head, and then trapped herself in the silver moon of the plane. Now, this has been a near exclusive critique of the way that Magic the Gathering depicts madness, but this isn't to say that the game gets it wrong at every turn. Whilst it's true that the vast majority of depictions of insanity and unreason fall into cliché or harmful tropes, it's certainly not universal, and in rare cases, depictions of madness can be genuinely refreshing. Peace of Mind is an uncommon enchantment from Eldritch Moon that I bet many of you have long since purged from your memory. The art depicts an old woman overpouring a cup of tea, distracted by a passing butterfly, sitting on the porch of a dilapidated house. The flavor text defines her as being one of the minds touched by Emrakul's madness, yet she has none of the violence or bloodthirst of the cultists or werewolves of the story. She is mad, certainly existing in an affront to the social structures of her world, unable or unwilling to cooperate with them, but, for lack of a better term, she is just vibing. Depictions of madness that don't carry some kind of sinister undertone are so rare in popular media that, despite this being a fucking atrocious card, its artwork and image has stuck with me for the 7 years since it was printed. There's no way that what we would call madness in our contemporary reality would be the perspective shared by someone living in classical Greece or in Innistrad, where disembodied voices, spectres from the past, and becoming a raging monster under the light of the full moon would more accurately be diagnosed as Tuesday. What normal behaviour, thinking, and experience is far from a fixed thing. As James Davies puts in Cracked, the symptoms of mental health issues are like stars. No matter where you are in the world, you can see them. They may look different from one place to the next, but they are there. Mental health labels and diagnoses are like constellations. Yes, they are materially and culturally significant, but fundamentally those lines don't exist. They need to be drawn. People tend to forget as well that suffering from bad mental health or even experiencing a symptom of a mental health disorder does not necessarily mean you have that disorder. Far more evidence has been found linking the actual material conditions of people diagnosed with mental health issues as a contributing factor to those issues and the source from which the resolution of those issues can be found than there have been issues inherent in their brain biology. But if our understanding of madness has improved to the point where we are able to recognise that it exists far more as a complex conversation between ourselves and the society and culture that we live in, more than an inexplicable quirk within our internal brain chemistry, and if evidence exists that suggests that improving people's material conditions is a far better indicator for them dealing with negative mental health, at least in combination with medication, why is medicalization the order of the day when it comes to our contemporary treatment of mental illness and mental health disorders? I don't know, and that was a very, very long tangent. I am so sorry. This video was supposed to be about Mill versus Discard, and I've gone completely off track. I think... Fucking hell!
I feel you need to develop this further.
Did you just throw Mark Fisher at me? Also, who are you? Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice 8rack here, aka We Have Noah Sampson at Home, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are doing it. We are finally talking about Mill versus Discard. But frankly, it would be impossible for us to have a conversation about Mill and Discard without first talking about how both of these mechanics represent memory. But in order to even do that, we need to talk about both how and why memory is represented in the way that it is within Magic the Gathering itself as a whole. In Magic, memory is something that exists both internally and externally. Spells, such as the reasonably benign Go Blank and the far more insidious Drowner of Memory, seek to sculpt memories from your opponent's mind, aka the hand and the library. However, memory doesn't exist exclusively within the brain, both in real life and also in Magic. Your graveyard is a place of things waiting to be remembered, such as through cards like Call to Memory. Fade from Memory has the exact opposite gameplay effect, removing a card from a graveyard so that its owner can no longer access it, whilst narratively suggesting that the reason for that happening is because that the owner of that card can no longer remember that card's existence. Paradoxically, however, cards like Release to Memory have the exact same gameplay effect, removing cards from the graveyard, but narratively suggest something wildly different, suggesting that those cards that have been removed are remembered, but that memory is not a tangible thing that the owner of that previous card can now access. Oh, it's fascinating. The utility of memory is defined very differently between zones in Magic, but usually only in one of two different ways. The first being a literal memory held in one's head, and the other being an item which acts as some kind of material record or icon of memory, be it a literal record or an item uncovered from an archaeological dig. Legacy articles such as this, like ancient ruins, statues, or streets named after you, are viewed as imperfect remedies to mortality. We can't live forever, but the idea of us can live on in some kind of legacy, as the philosopher Cicero put it. Hey, the life of the dead is placed under the memory of the living. I'm sorry, I forgot to get someone to do the voiceover for this quote, so I decided to do it myself. It follows, then, that should those memories disappear, so does the life of the dead. Indeed, the loss of memory, either internally or externally during life, is viewed as a form of death. There are dozens of stories where someone wakes up to a world that's forgotten them and it's like they've ceased to exist, despite still being alive. Most of us who've had a relative suffer from an illness related to memory loss would have heard phrases like, "It's better now, she really wasn't herself," after they've passed away, as if their material state now properly matches their cognitive state. Indeed, the very idea of memory loss conjures up images of mortality, white-haired, old people in beds, blank stares, helplessness and confusion. In this way, the game loss effect that comes about as a result of being milled could well be seen as a symbol for this metaphorical death. As your deck thins, so does your memory, so does your mortality. However, this grim and bleak perspective on degenerative memory loss conditions makes life incredibly difficult for people who actually have them. Long before the metaphorical death of dementia that precedes the real death of the body comes confinement, the death of one's liberty. People who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, for example, often find it necessary to hide their diagnosis if they are in work for fear of losing their job and their relative autonomy within the world as a result. Important and personal affairs in people's lives, such as medical care or their finances, are, upon diagnosis, immediately assumed to be the responsibility of their carers or family, regardless of how capable the person who has been diagnosed actually is at the time. To personalise this a little bit, Wendy Mitchell was an NHS registrar before she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's and dementia. In the phenomenal 2 books that she has published since her diagnosis, she details not only how the illness impacts her life, but also how people and the world treat her as a direct result of this diagnosis. In Somebody Who I Used to Know, her first book, Wendy describes the day that she was let go from her job after telling her workplace about her diagnosis.
It is as if the decision had already been made for me before I even entered the room. I watch as she makes notes and doesn't look up to include me. Perhaps she thinks she's making it easier for me this way, making decisions so I don't have to. Others have also suggested I retire due to sickness, but I've shunned the idea. I'm not sick, I am well. I just need help and advice. But it's sadness, not anger, that wells inside me. She has a form in front of her where she needs to write her recommendations, and I sit watching, helpless as she begins to fill in one particular section, incapable of meeting the demands of her NHS employment. As I leave her office, clutching a copy of the form filled in, any hope I had in the health system evaporates. I have been able to advise them far more than they have me. I am working within the NHS and I still can't get the support I need. What chance do others with dementia have?
Mitchell goes on to describe a myriad of different ways that this perception of people with dementia exclude them from agency and lead them to be confined in other people's care and decisions. Nurses won't even trust her to take off her own shoes, let alone participate actively in a conversation about her treatment, unless she stands up and fights for it. This social confinement also, of course, manifests itself in environmental and material ways, some of them ostensibly kind, such as with the dementia villages that you might find in the Netherlands, US, or UK. These are simulated small towns populated by people with severe dementia and care staff, where the residents with dementia do things like hold down fake jobs and drive fake cars. Not unlike how the modern asylum was a preferable environment for people with mental health disorders as compared to the hellish houses of confinement, these fake villages may be a preferable environment to live in as compared with modern state care homes, which don't have an amazing track record of treating people with severe dementia particularly well. But fundamentally, both of them are forms of confinement, meant to keep people who in some way affront or don't fit into bourgeois order safe and inside. It's just that the edges have been rounded off. Alternatively, as Mitchell lays out, there are many ways in which people living with dementia can still be actively included in society. Dementia cafes, for example, offer voluntary roles which build on the strengths and skills of people living with dementia, which allow them to continue to live and participate in their local community. And the Yellow Bracelet Project is a Chinese initiative where GPS-fitted bracelets are given to people living with dementia, which allow them an autonomy of movement in their everyday life and which act as a safety net just in case those people get lost. Obviously, these initiatives on their own aren't going to resolve everything, and nor are they necessarily going to work or even be wanted by different people living with dementia. But they certainly represent a far more liberatory way of viewing dementia, as opposed to the social and environmental confinement that is kind of the norm of the discussion today. The view that a declining memory means the inevitable and rapid deterioration of a person's quality of life is only because the world and environment that we exist in rarely accommodate for anything other than a norm of behaviour and ability. Here's that from Wendy's perspective.
Dementia has a beginning before the end, and so much life to live in between. Don't give up on us, as no matter what stage we're at, we still have so much to give. We just might give it in different ways.
And Wendy Mitchell is an absolute testament to this. In the same time span between me announcing that I wanted to make a video about Mill and Discard to me actually sitting down to make Mill versus Discard, she's written 2 books. In contrast, this is what I've been doing. Dancing Sword. But of course, it's not just through illness that memory can be lost, and indeed, many different things, both material and immaterial, can embody the theme of memory. Takacia's Dig Site as a card is a phenomenal example of this. When you activate this card's surveil ability, you look at the top card of your library, and then depending on what it is, you can either choose to put it into your graveyard, getting rid of it, or keeping it on top, choosing to draw it later. Now, at first blush, this is a incredibly simple mechanic, but when you take this into account with the ideology that drove both Urza and Mishra during the Brothers' War, it's phenomenally flavorful. You become like them, scouring through the history of your world, not preserving it for the sake of preservation, but looking for useful tools that you can use to bring about a swifter end to your battle, in the same way that countless cultural art attacks? By that same token, you strip mine your own deck, discarding any number of cards, destroying any number of cultural artifacts, all in the pursuit of the weapon that will bring a swift end to your battle. You decide what history is remembered not for any moral reason, but for a pure, cold, and hard need to win a war. It's a chef's kiss of flavour. Right on the tip of my monster dog. But returning to the memories that live up here for a moment, the major literal and material way that Magic the Gathering shows memories being purged from one's mind is usually through some kind of trauma. Resounding Scream, Amnesia, and Traumatize itself all show memories being wiped clear from an opponent's mind through trauma, be it physical, visual, or inexcrutably magical. The reality of this is, of course, a lot more complicated than simply traumatic events can delete memories from your brain. But it's by no means wholly incorrect to connect trauma and memory loss, or at least a change in how memories work. Traumatic memories are fundamentally different from the stories we tell about our past. They are disassociated due to how the brain processed the trauma as it was happening. One notable trend, for example, is how traumatic memories often hyper-focus on specific details whilst losing their narrative coherence. A pleasant road trip memory may well be told with a clear beginning, middle, and an end. Who said what, which led to what decision, etc. Whereas a traumatic traffic collision on that same road trip may be remembered only in fragments, the look on the other driver's face, or the sound of metal. Traumatic experiences can also cause memories to be repressed for years if they ever get remembered at all. Research indicates, for example, that it could all depend on the amount of adrenaline your body secretes during a traumatic event. The more you secrete, the more precise your memory will be, up until a certain point where the system becomes overwhelmed and fundamentally breaks down. I'd say that Magic the Gathering gets how trauma can impact memory about as right as a collectible card game about dragons and H.R. Geiger waifus can. However, there is one major flaw from my perspective in how this game does treat the idea of trauma, and that comes in the form of how it deals with healing. You can heal damage taken during a game of Magic by gaining life, and most cards which let you do that are pretty accurate to how that might actually function in reality. Eating food, drinking medicine, having a big cat say hello to you when you turn up to a party, etc. However, the way to remedy the effects of trauma and memory loss in Magic is both a lot less consistent and also a lot less accurate to reality. Most of the ways to offset memory depleting effects come in the form of effects which let you retrieve lost cards from your graveyard to your hand or library, or by replacing lost cards in your hand by drawing more from your deck. The very existence or potential of memory is often positioned as a bulwark against other ailments of the mind. It was a Freudian notion that through remembering past trauma alone, one could overcome it, and we see memory being used to dispel madness all the time in media. The Hulk must be reminded of his past existence as Bruce Banner to calm down and return to his human, read sane, form. Alice Price desperately attempts to return to mind her lover's memory of himself whilst he's in his bestial form, and her failure to do so is immediately followed by the death of the American werewolf. In London! Magic is no stranger to this trope. Peace of Mind is an uncommon enchantment from Eldritch Moon that I bet many of you have long since purged from your memory. The art depicts an old woman overpouring a cup of tea, distracted by a passing butterfly and sitting on the porch of a dilapidated house. The flavor text defines her as being one of the minds touched by Emrakul's madness, yet she has taken shelter in her memories rather than succumb to, quote, raging psychosis. The implication here being that, without memory, madness can run rampant in a mind. Freud very much alive and well in the stories we tell about our minds. And not unlike somebody slowly splunking into a cow dung silo, as time goes on, we get a greater understanding of just how full of bullshit this motherfucker was. Modern research has shown that simply remembering an experienced trauma or something lost as a result does not in of itself resolve the issue. Being able to find the words to describe an experienced trauma can be transformative, but even then, that does not abolish flashbacks or counter any of the other potential maladies that an experienced trauma may inflict on its own. Nothing can undo a traumatic event or replace a bad or lost memory. You're not getting those cards back from the graveyard. That is literally just magic. But it doesn't mean that people who experience traumatic events can't go on to live just as full lives as they would have done should that event not happen to them. But certainly that is predicated on those people, A, being given the tools by which they can work through that, and B, being in an environment that actively supports them whilst they do that. Trauma can fundamentally rework the mechanics of our brains, right down to our basic housekeeping functions like eating and sleeping, in ways that can't ever entirely be undone. Even if you don't remember a traumatic event, your body may well keep the score and cause you to perceive and interact with the world in an often upsetting or confusing way. Having a trauma response whilst not even being aware that you had trauma that you're responding to. In a deeply ironic capacity, Magic the Gathering's many time reversal style effects, where graveyards get shuffled into libraries or hands and you begin anew, represent the only real way that trauma can be fully resolved. The only way to truly abolish all of the negative impacts that trauma may have on somebody, the only way to truly recover a lost memory, is to prevent that loss from happening in the first place. Which is why the vast majority of literature on the topic of trauma all end up advocating for preventative, political, and educational policies aimed at stopping future trauma from happening. In summary, If we were being cynical in our analysis, we could make the argument that losing to Mill and Magic the Gathering is both symbolic for the metaphorical death that one experiences as a result of losing one's memory, but also symbolic for the social death that many with dementia also experience, where their liberty becomes restricted, their autonomy disappears as they are subjected to both interpersonal and systemic confinement. Not too dissimilar to how the mad were treated during the Great Confinement back in the Renaissance. But that does beg a question. Why is it that our perspective on those who act as an affront to bourgeois order hasn't really meaningfully shifted since that period all that many hundreds of years ago? Well, to answer that question, I think we're going to have to go a little bit deeper. Thanks for the book.
You're welcome.
Oh, hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice 8-Rack here, aka I'm not trapped in England, England is trapped with me, and welcome back to the channel. To me, one of the most interesting aspects of media which engages with settings or ideas from a real or an imagined past is how archaic icons and themes are treated with modern sensibilities. War is a great example of this. When you compare the grim, dark crush of a medieval battle as depicted in Game of Thrones to the exhilarating, triumphant heroism of Henry V, we can see how audiences' perceptions of war, what they actually want to see on stage or on film, has changed throughout the ages. Once more onto the breach, dear friends. Once more! Or close that wall up with our English dead. In peace, nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in your ears, then imitate the actions of the tiger. Strengthen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-fought rage. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, straining for the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry for God, Harry, England, and St. George! We can see how depictions of fantasy warfare have been massively influenced by contemporary depictions of modern war, brutal, random and messy, with the Battle of the Bastards being far more reminiscent of Saving Private Ryan than the noble tales of chivalrous knights from bygone eras. Also, the silly music is only here so that I don't get a copyright strike. It should not be in any capacity viewed as a comment on the dramatic or artistic quality of Game of Thrones: The Battle of the Bastards. However, whilst many themes and ideas have shifted in how they are talked about within literature and media, war, religion, race, sexuality, etc., madness really hasn't in the grand scheme of things. The madness of Daenerys Targaryen, for example, is treated with the same kind of fear, treated with the same kind of confusion, treated with the need to be contained or destroyed in the same real capacity as madness and the mad were treated in plays by Shakespeare. Out! Damn Spot! Out, I say! 1, 2... Why, then 'tis time to do it. Hell is murky. Fie, my lord, fie, a soldier and a beard! What need we fear who knows yet, when none can call our power to account? Yet who'd have thought the old man to have so much blood in him? In both cases, madness either comes as the result of misdeeds or is the reasoning given as to why misdeeds are carried out. Be it the slaying of a lord or mass murder via dragonfire, madness is interwoven within the root of atrocity. And yes, this time the silly music should be taken as a comment on the artistic quality of Daenerys Targaryen's character arc. But why is this? Well, if you allow someone who has literally no relevant education, let alone qualifications, to hazard a guess, I'd say it's got something to do with the fact that the fundamental way that we view and understand the mad and madness in society today hasn't actually changed all that much since the days of the Great Confinement. That tea is ice cold, by the way, which might have something to do with the fact that I brewed it this morning when I wanted to start filming this video, but then I realised that the script wasn't working out exactly as I wanted to, so I went away to edit it down and ended up inserting 2 literal Shakespeare monologues at the start, because apparently I never want to see this video be completed. In yesteryears, madness was dealt with through the nightmarish houses of containment and later asylums, but today there still exists containment, both similar to the asylum and also in a far more widespread, individualised form, the latter of which picking up where the houses of containment left off in terms of confinement acting as a means of generating productivity. In 2021, 7.4 million adults in the UK were prescribed antidepressants, roughly 1 out of every 5 adults working today, and some workplaces offer things such as mental health first aid and other such programs. These sound like they exist to improve the mental health of people in the workplace, and certainly on first blush it's a good thing for workplaces to recognise that mental health is something to talk about and pay attention to. However, more often than not, mental health first aid programs are just a means of signposting workers to other mental health services, which invariably medicalise their complaints and prescribe drugs to combat them. The prescribed root cause of the problem, pardon the pun, has superficially shifted from lacking morals to chemical imbalances, but the flaw remains internal to the mad and can only be contained until the mad has resolved the issue in of themselves. It is you who is sick. It is you who is at fault. It is only through you changing that these problems can be resolved, and if you don't, you need to go away. And this is far from unintentional. Misdirecting the understanding of what causes and can aid the traumatized, quote-unquote mad, or people with memory loss is a key part of capitalism's survivability. It's no coincidence that, along with Jewish, Marxist and trans literature, the Nazis also burnt research into the effects traumatic events had on the human mind, including the semi-fictional All Quiet on the Western Front, even raiding cinemas where they were showing the film adaptation. The denial of the material reality of trauma or mental illness allows the present conditions of society to continue unquestioned. As capitalism decays into fascism, this denial informs an intolerance of weakness, which plays an ever more important role in reawakening those archaic calls for moral, disciplinary, medicalized, or genetic solutions to weak degeneracy. But we don't live in a fascist state. Some of us don't live in a fascist state. Okay, some of us don't live in a fascist state yet. So what is the material root for this misdirection of blame when it comes to madness today? Well, first off, the vast majority of capital that can be accessed for the research or treatment of people with mental illnesses comes through the pharmaceutical industrial complex. Indeed, many research proposals that seek to find out the efficacy of non-medicalized ways of treating or preventing mental illnesses from happening in the first place often do get rejected for funding outright. Additionally, less than 10 years ago, all research into mental illnesses and all academic courses which sought to understand mental disorders used as their foundation the DSM, kind of an Argos catalogue of mental health disorders decided upon by a small task force of psychiatrists, many of whom had direct financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry, including 3 previous chairs of the DSM. Additionally, the way that the disorders in the DSM are determined is laughably unscientific, decided via committee vote as opposed to rigorous scientific analysis, with previous heads of the DSM admitting that biological research doesn't actually guide the expansion of the manual. And if that wasn't bad enough, the votes themselves within the DSM task force committees are farcical at best. On one occasion, I was sitting in on a task force meeting, and there was a discussion about whether a particular behaviour should be classed as a symptom of a particular disorder. And as the conversation went on, to my great astonishment, one task force member suddenly piped up. "Oh no, we can't include that behaviour as a symptom, because I do that." And so, it was decided that that behaviour would not be included, because presumably, if someone on the task force does it, it must be perfectly normal. That was a story from Renee Garfinkel, a psychologist who participated in 2 DSM advisory committees. To nip this in the bud, however, this is not me saying that all such diagnoses are based on smoke and that any medication you are prescribed as a result should automatically be thrown in the bin. Medicalization can be detrimental, but this is obviously not the case for many people or for many conditions like epilepsy, for example, which at one time was very unhelpfully understood as a religious matter that the church alone could solve or purge. Medicalizing epilepsy was absolutely a progressive step forward for many people who have it. And neither does all of this obvious buffoonery and conflict of interest come as the sole result of individual malice or greed. Yes, it is true that anybody who makes big money off of the pharmaceutical industrial complex is, by definition, the devil from the Bible, but this is just how capitalism functions, and indeed what capitalism needs to do in order to survive. In order to survive, capitalism must always be growing, and in order to continually grow, new markets need to be opened up. And the simultaneous depoliticization and commercialization of mental illness has opened up a vast market where capital can sell products to take the edge off of problems either caused directly by the hellscape of neoliberalism or indirectly caused by conflict exacerbated or encouraged by that same hellscape. As the conditions in which people live get worse, as their places of work or learning become harsher, as the prospect of attaining the lie of capitalism that hard work will build you a better life becomes even less realistic, hardships inevitably become rooted in the minds of the people. The late Mark Fisher put it best.
Many teenagers I worked with had mental health problems or learning difficulties. Depression is endemic. It is the condition most dealt with by the NHS, and is afflicting people at increasingly younger ages. It is not an exaggeration to say that being a teenager in late capitalist Britain is now close to being reclassified as a sickness. This pathologization already forecloses any possibility of politicization. By privatizing these problems, treating them as if they were caused only by chemical imbalances in the individual's neurology and/or by their family background, any question of social systemic causation is ruled out.
And I really can't stress how every single book I've read on the topic of mental health for this video, be it philosophical or scientific, has stressed that the solution to madness does not lie in attempting to eliminate it with medical intervention, but in either the improvement or fundamental restructuring of the environment and society to allow for a liberation of madness. And one of the reasons why this video took so long for me to make is because I was so terrified of getting something wrong in a section like this that I read a lot of books. Books like Alex Vitale's End of Policing, which points out that the most likely non-medical intervention a mentally unwell person will experience in the United States is via the police, who will necessarily view that person through a criminalized lens and whose interaction will most likely end up with that person either being put in prison or just murdered. If you examine things for longer than a few moments, the distance between our society and the society of the Great Confinement really is not that far at all. There are many actions that we could take to drastically improve things, education being one of the major ones. both in the sense that it would be an objective good for people with mental health disorders or major memory problems to be able to rely on a greater number of strangers around them in their day-to-day to act accordingly, but also because the more years of education you have, the less likely you are to develop dementia in the first place. And this can be both academic and creative, but also just in your place of work, such as London cab drivers who have to routinely learn new ways to get around the city. I, fool that I was, used to curse Dr. Kawashima for causing me to snap a DS stylus when trying to write maths quickly, but now I have to thank him, for the hippocampus his brain training has gifted me is thick, robust, and juicy. Unfortunately, the liberation of madness can never occur under capitalism, whose inbuilt inequalities such as unequal exchange, social alienation, and necessary poverty and unemployment, to name just a few, exacerbate the very same mental health issues that capitalist companies say they care so much about. Equally, when your ability to live freely and comfortably in this world, at least relatively speaking, requires you to sell your labour power for the majority of your life to a private employer, the people who embody Foucault's affront to bourgeois order come in direct conflict with the bourgeoisie and their desire to have the most productive and cheapest workforce possible as a means of competing with the rest of their class. As a result, the people whose madness can be confined via medicine are begrudgingly allowed into the workforce, whereas everybody who can't are condemned to either eternal unemployment or straight up sectioning. In a way, losing to Mill, being driven mad, having your memory wiped, having your deck removed from the game is an extension of this thinking. You, the player, are still there. You may still have cards in your hand, creatures on the field, life points on your dice, but without a deck, you're no longer able to participate in the game system the way the game system was designed for you to participate in. Therefore, you're out. Capital cares about your mind and memory only up until the point when preserving such things are no longer profitable for capital itself. And funnily enough, Wizards of the Coast is a really good example of this in recent practice. During the fourth rewrite of this script, I found this really fascinating article that described the hand and the library zones of the game in terms of flavour, and I thought that's a fantastic theoretical foundation for me to build my entire video on. During the eighth rewrite of this script, I went back to try and find those articles to get screenshots to put in this video, and they were no longer there. The links that I had diligently saved now produced 404 pages, and when I went online to find out what had happened, I discovered that between rewrites of this script, Wizards of the Coast had migrated the Magic the Gathering mothership from one server to another, and in that process had lost 90% of their 20-year history of publishing digital written content about their game. It's quite difficult to showcase just how many articles have been lost, but here's an example. This is the reference section on the MTG Wikis page for the zombie subtype. Everything circled in blue is a link to either another wiki page, a downloadable document, or something produced by someone or a company other than Wizards of the Coast, like Loading Ready Run or Kate Elliott. Every footnote that hasn't been circled does indeed take you to a live article on the Magic the Gathering mothership. Everything circled in red, however, produces a 404 page. Everything. So there are only 9 live links here. 9 links that if you click on them will take you to anything other than a 404 page or something completely unrelated to Wizards of the Coast. And I've only just realised as I'm recording this that 3 of those links take you to Mark Rosewater's Blogatog, which is a Tumblr blog, so it's hosted by another website anyway. So only 6. There are only 6 links here that Wizards has actually gone out of their way to maintain. 6 links out of 39. And this is just one page. This is just one wiki article. Wait, no, it's not 6. It's 5. I didn't count the very first reference, which is also a blogatog. Holy shit, there are only 5 links here being maintained by Wizards of the Coast themselves. This is a fucking multi-million-dollar company. Can't you fucking buy some hard drives? It probably would have cost a lot of time, money, and labour for Wizards of the Coast to ensure that all of the vital games design, art guide, play report, and lore articles from throughout their digital history was safely preserved and re-uploaded to the new server in case data was lost during the transfer. So they just didn't fucking do it. I had to use the bloody Wayback Machine to access the articles that I needed to, and I know that other content creators are having a similar struggle. Like, gee, I sure am glad for individual volunteers like Max Makes Magic, who's jerry-rigged a open source table of contents for sorts to go through different articles' authors and find their work. I'm so grateful for unpaid donation-based volunteers who've decided to uphold a multi-million-dollar company's archive of nearly 25 years of games design history. I'd prefer it if they just did it themselves, though, not gonna lie. Don't worry, though, Wizards of the Coast made absolutely sure that all of the Secret Lair announcement articles managed to survive the transfer. Sorry, I blacked out for a moment doing that scream for real, but don't worry, I am better now. What I'm saying is that the means by which we genuinely preserve memory and will genuinely liberate madness requires fundamentally anti-capitalist action. And in order to enshrine these ideas within our world system, we would therefore need a fundamentally anti-capitalist world system itself. Now, what that world system would look like and how we get there, well, that's a topic for another video, you silly dolt. We're talking about Magic the Gathering and Mill versus Discard in this one, you little goon, which is why I've spent the last 25 minutes talking about capitalism. Oh, I keep doing it. I swear this is like the 3rd, 4th, 5th time I've done something like this. I just keep going on wild tangents that have nothing to do with either mill or discard, and they just... God, this is like a recurring nightmare, I swear to you.
Oh, don't worry. We'll be able to make it work.
Oh, it's you?
Yeah, it's me.
I knew it. I felt deja vu doing the Wayback Machine bit, but it wasn't deja vu, was it? Was it? I've done that before.
Yes, you have. In fact, this would be the 3rd time you've done it.
Oh, sweet God, no, you're in my head. How many times have I done the whole thing?
Oh, my sweet child. Not enough, I'm afraid.
Wait, what do you mean?
You were stuck. You said that mill and discard magic had contradictory aesthetics, resulting in neither one clearly affecting a different part of the brain, a different kind of memory, or instilling a unique flavour of madness.
Wait. Looking at the aesthetics for a clear delineation between mill and discard was flawed because no one aesthetic or image was necessarily mutually exclusive to one form of magic or another. Not unlike how presenting certain symptoms to a psychiatrist could have them tell you that you have any number of mental health disorders because of the massive flaws in the DSM's diagnostic boundaries.
Oh, how fitting. Aren't you a clever little thing?
Therefore, if a difference does exist between mill and discard, it can't be found in the aesthetic, it has to be found within the mechanical differences, which means... Yes, of course, I understand now. The answer was there from the get-go. I can complete mill versus discard!
Good, you're almost there. Now to wipe this and start from the beginning.
What? Now, I'm sorry, if you think you're gonna wipe me with those fingers, you have another thing coming. Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice 8-Rack here, aka Adjunct Professor at Silly Goose University, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are doing it. We are finally doing it. We are putting to bed that question which has plagued me, and potentially only me, for the course of my Magic the Gathering career, and that is what the actual difference is between mill and discard magic as it appears in Magic the Gathering. We can say, for example, that both mill and discard represent magic or events which seek to confound or addle your memory or your sanity. However, in attempting to work out exactly what differentiates these two forms of magic within the narrative of the game, we can find ourselves getting confounded very easily. Wow, 2 uses of the word confound in under a minute. Can you tell that I was watching The Glass Onion the night before I sat down to record this video? You see, if you focus exclusively on aesthetic and narrative when trying to differentiate between what mill and discard magic supposedly represent, eventually you run into contradiction. For example, if I were to describe a card whose effects implied the total loss of memory, you would assume that it would have mill stapled to it. Whereas in reality, a lot of cards which cause discard effects also fall into that aesthetic. Similarly, if I were to ask you what effects rats and spectres bring to mind when it comes to the gameplay of Magic the Gathering, you might say discard, despite the fact that there are rat cards and spectre cards which do indeed mill your opponents. As the result of both mechanics seemingly existing in an increasingly homogeneous aesthetic, it seems nearly impossible for anybody to narratively explain why certain magic evokes mill and certain magic evokes discard. However, there is one thing that has escaped this aesthetic melting pot. One gameplay difference between mill and discard that is left undefined, nebulous. One thing that I think, if properly explored, could elucidate the difference between these two mechanics in terms of what they mean narratively, what these effects are actually doing within the story of a game of Magic the Gathering. That thing is the game loss effect that comes as a result of being milled out. However, in order to fully understand why the game loss effect is such a significant part of my dissection of mill and discard's narrative, first, we need to get a tiny bit more complicated. We need to talk about the self. Ah, no! Horseboy! Self is a complicated thing. Yes, I'm fully aware that this video went off the rails so hard it's now on an entirely different set of rails, but you've come this far, why stop now? Odd thing to say at the beginning of a video, but whatever. Self isn't one specific thing, but more a coagulation of different composite parts. Much debate on the origin of self and what self even is or means exists, but putting aside metaphysical quackery for a moment, one hypothesis I find particularly interesting is that described by Drs. Barth, Appignanesi, and Kant in their essay on the bodily origins of self. They suggest that the enlarging body mass in our common ancestor, a tree-dwelling monkey, caused a greater degree in difficulty in them traversing their environment safely. As a result, the monkeys whose brains had advanced to the point where they were able to develop a kinesthetic sense of self, a better representation of one's own body and its ability to plan, operate, and predict the results of motor function, were far more likely to survive and pass those developments on to their offspring, effectively laying the foundation for what would one day become our understanding of self. Essentially, a bunch of chunky monkeys kept falling out of the trees and dying, except the ones with better brains, and that's why several thousand years later, listening to Everywhere at the End of Time in the Shower makes me question whether or not it would really matter if I melted into the drain along with the water. But self isn't innate nor eternal. It's very much something that develops and is learnt. It takes several months, for example, for infants to be able to recognise that the baby in a mirror is indeed themselves, due to the development of things like mirror motor neurons. Indeed, it is only with the discovery of the cognitive sense of self that autobiographical memories can be formed, retained, and maintained. As Mark Howe, one of the various phenomenal contributors to Psychology Press's Enlightening the Self and Memory puts it, consistent with the function and development of other knowledge structures in memory, once infants acquire a cognitive sense of self, they possess a new organizer around which event memories can be personalized and preserved as autobiographical. Sorry for the silly voice, I forgot to get someone to do the voiceover for this quote, so I did it myself. Wait, hang on, have I done that gag before? The reason why we all have our earliest memories a few years after being born and not before then is because our self, the foundation on which all of our autobiographical memory is based, had yet to actually fully develop. This scientifically confirms my long-standing belief that babies aren't people, and that the infant juggling competitions I ran during my stint as a maternity nurse were both fun and ethical. As I said before, what exactly self is still very much up for both scientific and philosophical debate, but what we can say safely is that self is not one specific thing. Depending on your perspective, there are a myriad of things that make the self up. There's the proto-self, the background noise and housekeeping facilities within our minds which underline our conscious sense of self, a direct development of that kinesthetic sense of self from earlier. There's the working self, a currently active set of goals and a knowledge base which informs your present behaviour, and why, when people for one reason or another have those goals or that knowledge removed or dampened via illness or alcohol, they're often described as not acting like themselves. Then there's the me self and the I self. The debate on each exact's definition being ongoing, as is the level of autonomy or cooperation between the two, but for ease, we can describe the me self as the person currently experiencing, reacting, and adapting to a present reality, whereas the I self exists outside of the present moment and provides continuity to your understanding of you, or provides the illusion of you as a continuous entity, your outlook very much depending on what kind of music you're listening to as you bathe. All of this is to say that self is a very complicated thing and thinking about it too hard makes your brain hurt. However, all of the things that Mill and Discard magic embody, entropy, madness, memory, all of these things impact, influence, and can diminish our sense of self. In terms of memory, for example, not only do autobiographical memories themselves determine who we view ourselves as being, but also how they're organised and even how they're told, how we retell those memories both to ourselves and to others, very much define who we view as us.
In the absence of a meaningful organization through which to understand our experiences, we may not be able to reintegrate those experiences into our self-understanding. This, in turn, may lead to a fragmented sense of self, as seen in abuse survivors, especially if the trauma occurs early in development before children have a stable self-concept or are able to construct a coherent narrative of a past event.
This disassociation may also bring the self into direct conflict with the body, where the body in its own autobiographical memory remembers things that the self does not, leading to further internal or even external conflict and potentially trauma, which then could potentially lead to a further fragmentation of the self. But it's not just issues with memory that can lead to a frustrated sense of self. For example, a breakdown in the neurons in the pathway between the insula, a section of the brain which amongst other things runs our self-awareness, to the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain which controls complex cognitive behaviour, can cause feelings, thoughts, and even actions to feel implanted by other people or forces, not originating from oneself. It is, however, important to note that an occurrence like this only really becomes madness or a needfully medicalised issue when negotiated as such. An example of what I mean by this was experienced by Dutch psychiatrist Marius Room in the 1980s. He hosted a television program where viewers who experienced auditory hallucinations, otherwise known as hearing voices, were encouraged to write in and share their experiences. During this process, it was found that roughly 1/3 of the correspondents' voices had had no negative impact on their lives and who had never felt the need to seek psychiatric treatment, despite experiencing one of the most supposedly alarming symptoms of a whole host of extreme mental disorders. Of course, there is a great difference between the temporary disassociation or a fragmentation of self that can be brought into a coherent self-concept given time and care, and the irreparable loss of self represented both by degenerative illness and inevitable entropy. And it's through the lens of this anxiety of self that we can finally uncover the difference between Mill and discard magic, specifically because of Mill's game loss effect. Discard magic seeks to disassociate the self, the player self, from the game. Mill magic seeks to destroy the self through its game loss effect. In Discard's case, the player loses its ability to act as it wished. Decisions that it wanted to make are no longer open to them. Its means of retelling its autobiographical memory deeply frustrated. A disassociation and fragmentation is forced between the player self, the omnipresent I, and the hand self, the highly subjective me. Within the narrative of Magic the Gathering, a deck can temporarily represent one's autobiographical memory, but within the actual meta of the game, the deck is self-expression. The deck is self-concept. It embodies all of the aesthetics, gameplay choices, and formats that a player wants to engage with. To lose the hand is to lose that player's ability, that self's ability to express accurately itself. It forces disassociation. However, to lose the deck is to lose the player entirely. And it's on this. This is the philosophical bedrock on which all of the distinctions between Mill and Discard are based. The fundamental thing that separates the two in a narrative capacity. For all of the aesthetic similarities, for all of the icons they both share, the ideas they explore, for all of the inconsistent narratives about what the deck and what the library even mean, it is this at the core of what makes Discard and Mill magic the magic that they are. Discard magic is magic aimed at the frustration and the disassociation of self. Mill magic is magic aimed at the total undermining and obliteration of self. That's it. Sisyphus rests. He lets his boulder tumble down the mountainside and kicks his feet up. Look at those vistas. Look at the view from up here. Prometheus lies back, no more raptors pecking at his stomach, and enjoys the breeze as it whistles. Enjoys the breeze alone. And that breeze carries with it sand from a distant desert. Dust which used to form a mighty pillar. A great inscription upon which kings and gods found themselves weeping. Now the wind alone asks, upon whose work should we gaze and tremble? It's done. and yet I am not. The deck is empty, and yet the game must continue. What do I mean? What is my purpose now? What happens after you are milled out?
Phenomenal work, albeit work that needn't have taken as long as it did.
Ashiok, what are you doing here? I know I didn't hire you for a dialectic. I stopped doing those ever since I had to shave off all my hair to play Domri.
Oh, make no mistake, I certainly was hired. You see, it's been almost 4 years since you promised to make Mill versus Discard, and a very interested party thought that you required some help on the project.
Okay, cool, but you haven't helped me at all? I didn't even know you were in the corner. I've been filming Mill vs. Discard all on my own.
Why, Spice, you seem confused. Here, maybe this will enlighten you.
When I was a kid, I was petrified of the idea of nothing coming after death. Yes, that's the tone setter for the video. My parents raised me in a pretty agnostic fashion. I say agnostic because... Sorry, what is this?
Just wait. There's more.
Spice walks in wearing a shitty Tormund cosplay. You might be wondering why I'm dressed like the final boss in a video game about an invasion of theatre kids, but I'll get onto that in a bit. For now, let's jump into the histories of both Mill and Discard and see... Were you writing me Mill versus Discard scripts? I'm sorry, I didn't use any of them.
Oh, of course, these aren't my scripts. Why, these are from 2019 all the way to 2022. You have nearly a dozen files titled videoplan_new_final cluttering up your Dropbox.
Okay. I'm really sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about.
You see, every time you sat down to write Mill versus Discard, you only ever got so far before you just stopped. Either the significance or depth of the project got far too much for you to handle, or a monthly deadline approached faster than you expected, or your undiagnosed ADHD got in the way.
Wait, no, hang on. I don't have ADHD.
My good bitch, I live in your walls. I see what your life is like. Who are you trying to fool here?
Enough. What are you doing? Why did I even hire you? Why can't I remember hiring you?
Your problem was a contradiction. Either the size of the project got away from you and you became overwhelmed attempting to dismantle a topic you were not well equipped enough to discuss in the first place, or you necessarily reduced the scope of what you were making and became riddled with anxiety that the thing that you would end up producing couldn't possibly live up to the years of teasing as a result. Either way, you stalled out. So, I resolved the contradiction. Over the past few months, you've made over half a dozen video essays about Mill versus Discard. Some looking at the topic from a purely gameplay perspective, others examining the aesthetics, others still viewing the mechanics through real-world parallels. And each time you reached a conclusion, each time you began to falter, I stepped in, wiped your memory clean, manipulated your dreams, and so, when you woke up, you began working on a new script, a new video examining Mill versus Discard from yet another perspective. As a result, the totality of the scope of the project remained grand, but your output was limited to reasonable, bite-sized video essayisms.
Months? You've been doing this for months?
Why, yes, since around, mid-August 2022.
Wait, I can't remember Christmas. I can't remember Christmas!
Oh yeah, you missed a bunch of things. Christmas, New Year's, the Nazi Pope died, Andrew Tate got arrested.
All those moments, lost like tears in the rain.
Yes, but think. You've done it. The white whale is dead. Mill versus Discard exists. The thing you have been promising to make since before YouTube was your full-time occupation. I may have helped, but fundamentally it's you. You who won.
I kind of hate to admit it, but I think you've got a point. Like, I feel like I have been recording for 2 odd hours, right? And I am physically and mentally exhausted of this topic, so if it took me that long to get this all together, maybe you were right to keep wiping my memory and force me to start again when it all got a bit much. So, yeah. You know what? Thank you, Ashiok the Nightmare Weaver, for all of your help on this video.
Oh, don't mention it.
And besides, losing my memory over the last couple of months can't be all bad. I must have missed, what, 20 Magic the Gathering releases? I tell you what, for nothing, certainly not mad that I missed the Queen's speech. Oh.
King's speech.
Oh. Wait, hang on, what?
It's the King's speech. The King did the speech, the Queen's dead.
The Queen died? I missed the Queen dying?
Well, a version of you didn't. A version of you had a great big party and sang Irish Republican anthems until the wee hours of the morning. But because you presently have no autobiographical record of such an event, it kind of means that, yes, the self that you are now did miss it. Isn't it wild to think about it like that? Self is such a crazy thing. I learned a lot about it from this video actually, so thanks for that. What? Oh, by the way, I noticed you didn't talk about any exile-style effects like cranial extraction. Can we expect that to be in Nil versus Discard too? Or did you just kind of forget those cards existed? Fucking hell.
Well, there you have it, folks. Mill versus Discard. What a wild ride that video was, I think. I can't really remember any of it. But what I do remember, however, is that I have quite a few people to thank for helping to put this project together. This was easily the most that I have ever worked on a video. I had something like 300 gigs of video footage by the end of my shoot that somehow I managed to edit down into 2.5 hours over the course of like 2 weeks. I'm currently recording this like I think 2 or 3 days before I put this video out, and my brain feels like a waffle that has been dropped in a puddle and then punched. But I can assure you that my brain waffle would have been far more eviscerated had it not been for some absolutely phenomenal contributions that a bunch of people made to the production of this video. First off, I want to thank Tim Getkir for just randomly, I didn't ask him to do this, but he just dropped into my Twitter replies and produced a really kick-ass thumbnail for this video. Again, did not commission this, didn't ask for him to do it, just did it out the kindness of his heart and sent it to me. Really appreciate that, Tim. Go check out his work. Links, as always, are going to be in the description below. I really want to thank James as well for that really beautiful piece of fan art that, again, just, didn't ask for it, just sent it into my Twitter DMs. Always love getting little pictures of myself. It's super, super cool, and it was really nice to have a Mill versus Discard specific one to kick this video off. I also want to thank Doodles. Doodles is the animator and artist who produced the phenomenal intro animation to my video, the one with Slowbad banging on the Iron Golem. I really, really appreciate that. It's so gorgeous and beautiful, and it makes me feel like a proper YouTuber to have it, so thanks so much for that. I also want to thank my friend Delphi. Before I sat down to record this video, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be spitting absolute bollocks or misinformation about the pharmaceutical industry or psychiatry or psychology or any of that gubbins. And so I really, really did appreciate an expert eye being placed over the actual script, the actual foundation of this piece. So thanks so much for all of the time that you spent on that, Delph. I really, really did appreciate it. And the books that you then recommended. And of course, I want to thank all of the people who lent their voice to reading quotes for this video. Always love getting people from Magic and other YouTube channels to come in and read a little bit. It makes the video seem a lot more impressive than it actually is. It got a bit masturbatory towards the end there with the Ashiok stuff, didn't it? Anyway, I really want to thank James from Humans of Magic, Corry of Still Not Corry and Psy Guys fame, Sam from Rhystic Studies, Shivam from the Casual Magic podcast, JT from Second Thought and the Deprogram, and Lily Simpson from Lily Simpson. Wow, Jesus, Lily, really fucked up the nice thematic naming convention we had going on there, didn't you? You bastard. I hope you're proud of yourself. I kid. We have fun here on the channel. All of these people are absolutely brilliant. You can check out their work in the links in the description. Lots of them I've done stuff with before, so either on this channel, on theirs, or on other people's, so also go check that stuff out. It's all nominally a good time. And speaking of good times, the only reason that I've had one whilst making this video is because of the immeasurable and incredibly appreciated support of the hundreds of people over on patreon.com/Spice8Rack. The entire reason it's taken so long for this video to come out is because I knew that this video was going to take a lot of time and effort to put together. It's Mill versus Discard. It's got to be big. And as a result, before I had the support that I have now on Patreon, I couldn't really afford to spend 4 months away from regular content just focusing on an incredibly specific and niche topic. Let alone an incredibly niche and specific topic that I would need to talk about incredibly sensitive and potentially add unfriendly topics in order to properly cover, like, mental illness and trauma. And so without support on Patreon, I would never have been able to make this video or any future video on my channel. So I genuinely can't thank my patrons enough. Thank you all. It doesn't matter if you give $1, it doesn't matter if you give $50. You're making me be able to eat and make art? I'm not sure about that last one, but certainly make something. So a massive thank you to all of my patrons, many of their names you can see scrolling up on your screen presently, and whose names also include a communist right dimple, a filthy communist bunny, a fool of 5 colours, a gay American couple, a metric ton of bees, a screaming Batman, a waste of a perfectly good skeleton, Adam Gable, Adam Ross Henry, Aesthetic Dialectic, AJ Ingram, Alessia Karnin, Alex Berman, Alex from Adelaide, Alguy D. Siswai, in parentheses, Barry, Alice Paralis, Ali, an alt-right sleeper agent who gives money to communists, Booker Idaka, and then in parentheses, probably Tybalt's persona, close parentheses, I draw penises on pastries, an entire council of ghosts, an exceedingly large moose, an exhausted capybara, an Umbreon pastry, Andrew Elf, Anne Morgana, Anonymous Anarchist, Anthony Baker, Aqua Regina, Asmora Nomadica Dicina Calder Cars Cooking Blog. Thanks for putting your name as that. It gets me practicing to say it really quickly and pretend that I'm cool. Astra Jade. At least Slowbad's not Tory levels of corrupted. Jesus fucking Christ, what are these names? That's heartbreaking. Aura Braxis Siberia. Austin L. Bacchus98. Basu Gasu Baku Hatsu Baku Matsu. Bazinga Bongos Badonkadonk needs love too. Ben Zimet, Big Rat Games, Bittercuppa Joe, Blake Evers, Bobby, Bradley Hutchison, Brian Dunn, Brian Rodham, Bridget Huang Tong, but you can call me Thrakazod, Cacophony, Kayla Blake, Kalulu, Captain Colostomy, Cara the Disaster, Caron Barboza, Carter Grissom, Charles Cohen, Chelsea Talbot, Chloe, Chromie, Krista Voss, Chris Kitsune Campbell, Serso Saresa, Clay, and finally, my most favourite patron, Cognitive Glitch, Conflicted Psyches, Corry Herman, Crocist, Curtis Paul Fleming, Darius Rudeminer, Dark Kijin, Darth Pink Hippo, David Reynolds, Deadpan Goth, Dean Pio Quidio, Draconig, Duncan Lindsay, Edward Gordon, Effie Eldon, Exidian, Eldritch Changeling, Elizabeth, Eric Lindahl, Etienne Champion Masson. Everyone loves robots. Faxel, Felix Mortem, Fiona, Fofu, Foxy Dean, Future Beagle, Gab Larod, Judge of Jank, Gavin Verhey, oh hello, George Anderson, Georgian Tom, Gitu Nullmage, Grey Days, Guilty Sonder, Gundy, Hand Singular. Have you considered human rights, maybe? Homosexual bird that steals shiny things. How to PNP. Hoopered up. Hypercube MTG. I'm abusing my powers to make Spice 8-Rack say silly things like this here. I am saying this only because our global economic system does not intrinsically support artistic expression. I want Emrakul to dominate me. If we take Baudrillard's analysis, magic itself becomes a solemn simulacrum, folding in on self-referential copies of Origin. I am not dead, I just ran out of jokes. Imbecilicus Rex. In response, I bolt myself. In response, table flip. In response, I mental misstep your bolt, paying 2 life. Oh, it's always a fucking gauntlet to get through that section, but I love it every single time. Jack Bland, Jackson Seamayer, Jackson West, Jacob Williams, Jake Colburn, Jake the Scrumptious Little Crumpet, JC Kairos, Jennifer Klein, Johnny Rifle, Josh, Joshua M. Stephan, Julie Bunn, Julius Home, June Violet Aino, June Duty Bound, Justin Dempsey, Just Mild Lilac, Carlia Whithart, Kansas the Jesus, Kate B, Kay Sandham, Ken O'Dies, Koo Zombie, Kurdape Apologizer, Kyle Denley, Lady Epona, Lee Barbs, Leone, Lover of Dragons, Let There Be Words, Lily of the North Star, literally a ghost that pushes over candles, Lonis, Crypto-Marxologist, Lupercilia X, Linnea, Madame Monroe, Magic Arcanum, Magic Fellow, Mario Romero, Matthew Miles, Meow Cerita, Metal Gamer 21, Micha, Moose, Morbid Panda, Miles Melson, Nathan Speepisman Harris, N. Ben, Nicholas Avery, No Bluffs, Num 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 Num, Yoshi, Nix Tucci, Ooh, Worm, Omar Altebayi. I'm so sorry, Omar. I know I keep mispronouncing your name, and I really do appreciate the continued support. Please, feel free to send me a Discord message with, the exact pronunciation, because I'm a fucking idiot who can't get it right. I do apologise. Anyway, one single mongoose, pronounced like mungus in humongous. Feel free to read this part out as well. Onion Knight Val, Oops or Saini, Papa Titan 14, Pappy Markov was a mistake, Patty Fism, Penguin Flight School LLC, Peter Carter, Filgamesh, I hope that was the right pronunciation, Filgamesh, Phoenix Swans, Pierce Finch Curtsy, Procrastatron 3000, Kwasu, Ram, read this in the voice of Werner Herzog. Replicase, Riley Cornett, Robson Yukon, Ross Conklin, Ruin Crab Your Orgasm, what? Sam Cook, Samuel Kona, Scrimblow Bimblow the Lovable Scrunko, Sen, Sentient Simic Value Engine with no real wincon, Several Goblins in a Trench Coat, Sean, Shifty H, Shy Boy Everest, Sigilius, Skolaton, Sky Johnson, Sorry Zia, Space Jozu, Springjacks, fuck! Stephen Christopher, Steve Grull, Stink Stifel Soria, Swan Hunter, Tamio's New Phyrexian Orphanage, Tanner the Big Sexy Dentist, Taylor Street, Thars, Refined Grizzly, the A-positive blood-type Goddess of Death, the Ghost of Karl Marx in 4D, the Jellybean Warlock, the Paultism, the Blood Lily, Thelon, the One Who Plays, the Reaper of You, Thomas Quinlan, Thomas Saint, Totally a Spy, aka He Who Sips for Emrakul, #free her, Travis K, Undead Herbs, Vats3, Velen Beleren, Veronica of the Kingdom, War Crimes Uwu, Wasson Ann, Watcher 9132, well, you asked for it, Wesley, that rat bastard communist. When I close my eyes, Niall Sylvain is there. watching, waiting, smiling. Christ, reading these credits is going to give me a nervous breakdown. Whirlwind Abyss, Wicked Haiku, William Lyndon Smith, Wolf and Stoat, a gay Americana love story, Xenon, Yuki Akama, Z13 Mia, Zachariah Bennett, Zadok Shark, and Xanaron. And a massive thank you to all of my other patrons. Again, doesn't matter if it's $1 or $20 or what have you. I really do appreciate it. Making these videos is a treasure and a joy. It's sometimes a nightmare, but fundamentally the only reason I'm able to do it is because of all of these people who decide that this is something they want to see in the world. I really appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you ever so much. I'm going to be either covering the ethical differences between mill and discard effects, or the pitfalls within comedic flavor text writing in the next episode. Let me know which one you'd like me to see cover, or your very own video idea. I am always open to new suggestions. As always, any comments, compliments, or critiques are always welcome, and stay spicy.